This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rachel Ellen. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 14. Molly finds herself patronized. The wedding went off much as such affairs do. Lord Cumnor and Lady Harriet drove over from the Towers, so the hour for the ceremony was as late as possible. Lord Cumnor came over to officiate as the bride's father, and was in more open glee than either bride or bridegroom, or anyone else. Lady Harriet came as a sort of amateur bridesmaid, to share Molly's duties, as she called it. They went from the manor house in 2 carriages to the church in the park, Mr. Preston and Mr. Gibson in one, and Molly, to her dismay, shut up with Lord Cumnor and Lady Harriet in the other. Lady Harriet's gown of white muslin had seen 1 or 2 garden parties, and was not in the freshest order. It had been rather a freak of the young ladies at the last moment. She was very merry, and very much inclined to talk to Molly by way of finding out what sort of a little personage Clare was to have for her future daughter. She began, "We mustn't crush this pretty muslin dress of yours. Put it over papa's knee. He doesn't mind in the least."
"What, my dear, a white dress? No, to be sure not. I rather like it. Besides, going to a wedding, who minds anything? It would be different if we were going to a funeral."
Molly conscientiously strove to find out the meaning of this speech, but before she had done so, Lady Harriet spoke again, going to the point, as she always piqued herself on doing. "I dare say it's something of a trial to you, this second marriage of your father's, but you'll find Clare the most amiable of women. She always let me have my own way, and I've no doubt she'll let you have yours." "I mean to try and like her," said Molly, in a low voice, trying hard to keep down the tears that would keep rising to her eyes this morning. "I've seen very little of her yet."
"Why, it's the best thing for you that could have happened, my dear," said Lord Cumnor. "You're growing up into a young lady, and a very pretty young lady too, if you'll allow an old man to say so, and who's so proper as your father's wife to bring you out, and show you off, and take you to balls, and that kind of thing. I always said this match that is going to come off today was the most suitable thing I ever knew, and it's even a better thing for you than for the people themselves."
"Poor child," said Lady Harriet, who had caught a sight of Molly's troubled face. "The thought of balls is too much for her just now, but you'll like having Cynthia Kirkpatrick for a companion, shan't you, dear?" "Very much," said Molly, cheering up a little. "Do you know her?" "Oh, I've seen her over and over again when she was a little girl, and once or twice since. She's the prettiest creature that you ever saw, and with eyes that mean mischief, if I'm not mistaken. But Clare kept her spirit under pretty well when she was staying with us, afraid of her being troublesome, I fancy." Before Molly could shape her next question, they were at the church, and she and Lady Harriet went into a pew near the door to wait for the bride, in whose train they were to proceed to the altar. The Earl drove on alone to fetch her from her own house, not a quarter of a mile distant. It was pleasant to her to be led to the hymeneal altar by a belted earl, and pleasant to have his daughter as a volunteered bridesmaid. Mrs. Kirkpatrick, in this flush of small gratifications, and on the brink of matrimony with the man whom she liked, and who would be bound to support her without any exertion of her own, looked beamingly happy and handsome. A little cloud came over her face at the sight of Mr. Preston. The sweet perpetuity of her smile was rather disturbed as he followed in Mr. Gibson's wake. But his face never changed. He bowed to her gravely, and then seemed absorbed in the service. 10 minutes, and all was over. The bride and bridegroom were driving together to the manor house. Mr. Preston was walking thither by a short cut, and Molly was again in the carriage with my lord, rubbing his hands and chuckling, and Lady Harriet, trying to be kind and consolatory, when her silence would have been the best comfort. Molly found out, to her dismay, that the plan was for her to return with Lord Cumnor and Lady Harriet when they went back to the Towers in the evening. In the meantime, Lord Cumnor had business to do with Mr. Preston, and after the happy couple had driven off on their week's holiday tour, she was to be left alone with the formidable Lady Harriet. When they were by themselves, after all the others had been thus disposed of, Lady Harriet sat still over the drawing-room fire, holding a screen between it and her face, but gazing intently at Molly for a minute or two. Molly was fully conscious of this prolonged look, and was trying to get up her courage to return the stare, when Lady Harriet suddenly said, "I like you. You are a little wild creature, and I want to tame you. Come here, and sit on this stool by me. What is your name? Or what do they call you, as North Country people would express it?" "Molly Gibson. My real name is Mary." "Molly is a nice, soft-sounding name. People in the last century weren't afraid of homely names. Now we are all so smart and fine. No more Lady Bettys now. I almost wonder they haven't rechristened all the worsted and knitting cotton that bears her name. Fancy Lady Constantia's cotton, or Lady Anna Maria's worsted." "I didn't know there was a Lady Betty's cotton," said Molly. "That proves you don't do fancy work. You'll find Clare will set you to it, though. She used to set me at piece after piece, knights kneeling to ladies, impossible flowers, but I must do her the justice to add that when I got tired of them, she finished them herself. I wonder how you'll get on together." "So do I," sighed out Molly, under her breath. "I used to think that I managed her, till one day an uncomfortable suspicion arose that all the time she had been managing me. Still, it's easy work to let oneself be managed, at any rate till one wakens up to the consciousness of the process, and then it may become amusing, if one takes it in that light." "I should hate to be managed," said Molly, indignantly. "I'll try and do what she wishes for papa's sake, if she'll only tell me outright, but I should dislike to be trapped into anything." "Now I," said Lady Harriet, "am too lazy to avoid traps, and I rather like to remark the cleverness with which they're set. But then of course I know that, if I choose to exert myself, I can break through the withes of green flax with which they try to bind me. Now perhaps you won't be able." "I don't quite understand what you mean," said Molly. "Oh, well, never mind. I dare say it's as well for you that you shouldn't. The moral of all I have been saying is, be a good girl, and suffer yourself to be led, and you'll find your new stepmother the sweetest creature imaginable. You'll get on capitally with her, I make no doubt. How you'll get on with her daughter is another affair, but I dare say very well. Now we'll ring for tea, for I suppose that heavy breakfast is to stand for our lunch." Mr. Preston came into the room just at this time, and Molly was a little surprised at Lady Harriet's cool manner of dismissing him, remembering as she did how Mr. Preston had implied his intimacy with her ladyship the evening before at dinner-time. "I cannot bear that sort of person," said Lady Harriet, almost before he was out of hearing, "giving himself airs of gallantry toward one to whom his simple respect is all his duty. I can talk to one of my father's labourers with pleasure, while with a man like that underbred fop, I am all over thorns and nettles. What is it the Irish call that style of creature? They've got some capital word for it, I know. What is it?" "I don't know. I never heard it," said Molly, a little ashamed of her ignorance. "Oh, that shows you've never read Miss Edgeworth's tales. Now, have you? If you had, you'd have recollected that there was such a word, even if you didn't remember what it was. If you've never read those stories, they would be just the thing to beguile your solitude. Vastly improving and moral, and yet quite sufficiently interesting. I'll lend them to you while you're all alone." "I'm not alone. I'm not at home, but on a visit to the Miss Brownings." "Then I'll bring them to you. I know the Miss Brownings. They used to come regularly on the school day to the Towers. Bexy and Flapsy I used to call them. I like the Miss Brownings. One gets enough of respect from them at any rate, and I've always wanted to see the kind of menage of such people. I'll bring you a whole pile of Miss Edgeworth's stories, my dear." Molly sat quite silent for a minute or two. Then she mustered up courage to speak out what was in her mind. "Your ladyship," the title was the first fruits of the lesson, as Molly took it, on paying due respect, Your ladyship keeps speaking of the class of people to which I belong, as if it was a kind of strange animal you were talking about. Yet you talk so openly to me that— Well, go on, I like to hear you. Still silence. You think me in your heart a little impertinent, now, don't you? Said Lady Harriet, almost kindly. Molly held her peace for 2 or 3 moments, then she lifted her beautiful, honest eyes to Lady Harriet's face and said, "Yes, a little. But I think you a great many other things." "We'll leave the other things for the present. Don't you see, little one, I talked after my kind, just as you talk after your kind. It's only on the surface with both of us. Why, I dare say some of your good Hollingford ladies talk of the poor people in a manner which they would consider as impertinent in their turn, if they could hear it. But I ought to be more considerate when I remember how often my blood has boiled at the modes of speech and behaviour of one of my aunts, mamma's sister, No, I won't name names. Anyone who earns his livelihood by an exercise of head or hands, or from professional people and rich merchants down to labourers, she calls persons. She would never in her most slip-slop talk accord them even the conventional title of gentlemen, and the way in which she takes possession of human beings, my woman, my people. But, after all, it is only a way of speaking. I ought not to have used it to you, but somehow I separate you from all these Hollingford people." "But why?" persevered Molly. "I'm one of them." "Yes, you are. But now don't reprove me again for impertinence. Most of them are so unnatural in their exaggerated respect and admiration when they come up to the Towers, and put on so much pretence by way of fine manners, that they only make themselves objects of ridicule. You, at least, are simple and truthful, and that's why I separate you in my own mind from them, and have talked unconsciously to you as I would—well, now here's another piece of impertinence—as I would to my equal, in rank, I mean, for I don't set myself up in solid things as any better than my neighbours. Here's tea, however, come in time to stop me from growing too humble." It was a very pleasant little tea in the fading September twilight. Just as it was ended, in came Mr. Preston again. "Lady Harriet, will you allow me the pleasure of showing you some alterations I have made in the flower garden, in which I have tried to consult your taste, before it grows dark?" "Thank you, Mr. Preston. I will ride over with papa some day, and we will see if we approve of them." Mr. Preston's brow flushed, but he affected not to perceive Lady Harriet's haughtiness, and, turning to Molly, he said, "Will you not come out, Miss Gibson, and see something of the gardens? You haven't been out at all, I think, excepting to church." Molly did not like the idea of going out for a tete-a-tete walk with Mr. Preston, yet she pined for a little fresh air, would have liked to have seen the gardens, and have looked at the manor house from different aspects, and, besides this, much as she recoiled from Mr. Preston, she felt sorry for him under the repulse he had just received. While she was hesitating, and slowly tending towards consent, Lady Harriet spoke. "I cannot spare Miss Gibson. If she would like to see the place, I will bring her over some day myself." When he had left the room, Lady Harriet said, "I dare say it's my own lazy selfishness has kept you indoors all day against your will. But at any rate, you are not to go out walking with that man. I've an instinctive aversion to him. Not entirely instinctive either. It has some foundation in fact, and I desire you don't allow him ever to get intimate with you. He is a very clever land agent, and does his duty by papa, and I don't choose to be taken up for libel. But remember what I say." Then the carriage came round, and after numberless last words from the Earl, who appeared to have put off every possible direction to the moment when he stood, like an awkward Mercury, balancing himself on the step of the carriage, they drove back to the Towers. "Would you rather come in and dine with us? We should send you home, of course, or go home straight?" asked Lady Harriet of Molly. She and her father had both been sleeping till they drew up at the bottom of the flight of steps. "Tell the truth, now and evermore. Truth is generally amusing, if it's nothing else." "I would rather go back to Miss Browning's at once, please," said Molly, with a nightmare-like recollection of the last, the only evening she had spent at the Towers. Lord Cumnor was standing on the steps, waiting to hand his daughter out of the carriage. Lady Harriet stopped to kiss Molly on the forehead, and to say, "I shall come some day soon, and bring you a load of Miss Edgeworth's tales, and make further acquaintance with Pecksy and Flapsy." "No, don't, please," said Molly, taking hold of her to detain her. "You must not come. Indeed, you must not." "Why not?" "Because I would rather not. Because I think that I ought not to have anyone coming to see me who laughs at the friends I am staying with, and calls them names." Molly's heart beat very fast, but she meant every word that she said. "My dear little woman," said Lady Harriet, bending over her and speaking quite gravely, "I'm very sorry to have called them names, very, very sorry to have hurt you. If I promise you to be respectful to them in word and deed, and in very thought if I can, you'll let me then, won't you?" Molly hesitated. "I'd better go home at once. I shall only say wrong things, and there's Lord Cumnor waiting all this time." "Let him alone. He's very well amused hearing all the news of the day from Brown. Then I shall come, under promise." So Molly drove off in solitary grandeur, and Miss Browning's knocker was loosened on its venerable hinges by the never-ending peal of Lord Cumnor's footman. They were full of welcome, full of curiosity. All through the long day they had been missing their bright young visitor, and 3 or 4 times in every hour they had been wondering and settling what everybody was doing at that exact minute. What had become of Molly during all the afternoon had been a great perplexity to them, and they were very much oppressed with the sense of the great honour she had received in being allowed to spend so many hours tete-a-tete with Lady Harriet. They were, indeed, more excited by this one fact than by all the details of the wedding, most of which they had known of beforehand, and talked over with much perseverance during the day. Molly began to feel as if there was some foundation for Lady Harriet's inclination to ridicule the worship paid by the good people of Hollingford to their liege lords, and to wonder with what tokens of reverence they would receive Lady Harriet if she came to pay her promised visit. She had never thought of concealing the probability of this call until this evening, but now she felt as if it would be better not to speak of the chance, as she was not at all sure if the promise would be fulfilled. Before Lady Harriet's call was paid, Molly received another visit. Roger Hamley came riding over one day with a note from his mother, and a wasp's nest as a present from himself. Molly heard his powerful voice come sounding up the little staircase, as he asked if Miss Gibson was at home, from the servant-maid at the door, and she was half amused and half annoyed as she thought how this call of his would give colour to Miss Browning's fancies. "I would rather never be married at all," thought she, "than marry an ugly man, and dear good Mr. Roger is really ugly. I don't think one could even call him plain." Yet the Miss Brownings, who did not look upon young men as if their natural costume was a helmet and a suit of armour, thought Mr. Roger Hamley a very personable young fellow, as he came into the room, his face flushed with exercise, his white teeth showing pleasantly in the courteous bow and smile he gave to all around. He knew the Miss Brownings slightly, and talked pleasantly to them, while Molly read Mrs. Hamley's little missive of sympathy and good wishes relating to the wedding. Then he turned to her, and though the Miss Brownings listened with all their ears, they could not find out anything remarkable either in the words he said, or the tone in which they were spoken. "I've brought you the wasp's nest I promised you, Miss Gibson. There has been no lack of such things this year. We've taken 74 on my father's land alone, and one of the labourers, a poor fellow who ekes out his wages by beekeeping, has had a sad misfortune. The wasps have turned the bees out of his 7 hives, taken possession, and eaten up the honey." "What greedy little vermin!" said Miss Browning. Molly saw Roger's eyes twinkle at the misapplication of the word, but though he had a strong sense of humour, it never appeared to diminish his respect for the people who amused him. "I'm sure they deserve fire and brimstone more than the poor dear innocent bees," said Miss Phoebe, "and then it seems so ungrateful of mankind, who are going to feast on the honey." She sighed over the thought, as if it was too much for her. While Molly finished reading her note, he explained its contents to Miss Browning.
My brother and I are going with my father to an agricultural meeting at Canonbury on Thursday, and my mother desired me to say to you how very much obliged to you she should be if you would spare her Miss Gibson for the day. She was very anxious to ask for the pleasure of your company too, but she really is so poorly that we persuaded her to be content with Miss Gibson, as she wouldn't scruple leaving a young lady to amuse herself, which she would be unwilling to do if you and your sister were there.
"I'm sure she's very kind, very. Nothing would have given us more pleasure," said Miss Browning, drawing herself up in gratified dignity. "Oh, yes, we quite understand, Mr. Roger, and we fully recognize Mrs. Hamley's kind intentions. We will take the will for the deed, as the common people express it. I believe that there was an intermarriage between the Brownings and the Hamleys a generation or two ago."
"I dare say there was," said Roger. "My mother is very delicate and obliged to humour her health, which has made her keep aloof from society."
"Then may I go?" said Molly, sparkling with the idea of seeing her dear Mrs. Hamley again, yet afraid of appearing too desirous of leaving her kind old friends.
"To be sure, my dear. Write a pretty note, and tell Mrs. Hamley how much obliged to her we are for thinking of us." "I'm afraid I can't wait for a note," said Roger. "I must take a message instead, for I have to meet my father at 1 o'clock, and it's close upon it now."
When he was gone, Molly felt so light-hearted at the thoughts of Thursday that she could hardly attend to what the Miss Brownings were saying. One was talking about the pretty muslin gown which Molly had sent to the wash only that morning, and contriving how it could be had back again in time for Molly to wear, and the other, Miss Phoebe, totally inattentive to her sister's speaking for a wonder, was piping out a separate strain of her own, and singing Roger Hamley's praises.
"Such a fine-looking young man, and so courteous and affable, like the young men of our youth, now, is he not, sister? And yet they all say Mr. Osborne is the handsomest. What do you think, child?"
"I've never seen Mr. Osborne," said Molly, blushing and hating herself for doing so. Why was it? She had never seen him, as she said. It was only that her fancy had dwelt on him so much. He was gone. All the gentlemen were gone before the carriage, which came to fetch Molly on Thursday, reached Hamley Hall. But Molly was almost glad. She was so much afraid of being disappointed. Besides, she had her dear Mrs. Hamley the more to herself, the quiet sit in the morning-room, talking poetry and romance, the midday saunter into the garden, brilliant with autumnal flowers, and glittering dewdrops on the gossamer webs that stretched from scarlet to blue, and thence to purple and yellow petals. As they were sitting at lunch, a strange man's voice and step were heard in the hall, the door was opened, and a young man came in who could be no other than Osborne. He was beautiful and languid-looking, almost as frail in appearance as his mother, whom he strongly resembled. This seeming delicacy made him appear older than he was. He was dressed to perfection, and yet with easy carelessness. He came up to his mother, and stood by her, holding her hand, while his eyes sought Molly, not boldly or impertinently, but as if appraising her critically.
"Yes, I'm back again. Bullocks, I find, are not in my line. I only disappointed my father in not being able to appreciate their merits, and I'm afraid I didn't care to learn. And the smell was insufferable on such a hot day."
"My dear boy, don't make apologies to me. Keep them for your father. I'm only too glad to have you back. Miss Gibson, this tall fellow is my son Osborne, as I dare say you have guessed. Osborne, Miss Gibson. Now, what will you have?" He looked round the table as he sat down.
"Nothing here," said he. "Is there not some cold game pie? I'll ring for that."
Molly was trying to reconcile the ideal with the real. The ideal was agile yet powerful, with Greek features and an eagle eye, capable of enduring long fasting, and indifferent as to what he ate. The real was almost effeminate in movement, though not in figure. He had the Greek features, but his blue eyes had a cold, weary expression in them. He was dainty in eating, and had anything but a Homeric appetite. However, Molly's hero was not to eat more than Ivanhoe, when he was Friar Tuck's guest, and after all, with a little alteration, she began to think Mr. Osborne Hamley might turn out a poetical, if not a chivalrous, hero. He was extremely attentive to his mother, which pleased Molly, and in return, Mrs. Hamley seemed charmed with him to such a degree that Molly, once or twice, fancied that mother and son would have been happier in her absence. Yet again it struck on the shrewd, if simple girl, that Osborne was mentally squinting at her in the conversation which was directed to his mother. There were little turns and fioriture of speech which Molly could not help feeling were graceful antics of language not common in the simple daily intercourse between mother and son. But it was flattering rather than otherwise to perceive that a very fine young man, who was a poet to boot, should think it worth while to talk on the tightrope for her benefit. And before the afternoon was ended, without there having been any direct conversation between Osborne and Molly, she had reinstated him on his throne in her imagination. Indeed, she had almost felt herself disloyal to her dear Mrs. Hamley when, in the first hour after her introduction, she had questioned his claims on his mother's idolatry. His beauty came out more and more as he became animated in some discussion with her, and all his attitudes, if a little studied, were graceful in the extreme. Before Molly left, the squire and Roger returned from Canonbury.
"Osborne here?" said the squire, red and panting. "Why the deuce couldn't you tell us you were coming home? I looked about for you everywhere, just as we were going into the ordinary. I wanted to introduce you to Grantley, and Fawkes, and Lord Forest, men from the other side of the county, whom you ought to know, and Roger there missed above half his dinner hunting about for you, and all the time you'd stole away and were quietly sitting here with the women. I wish you'd let me know the next time you make off. I've lost half my pleasure in looking at as fine a lot of cattle as I ever saw, with thinking you might be having one of your old attacks of faintness." "I should have had one, I think, if I'd stayed longer in that atmosphere, but I'm sorry if I've caused you anxiety." "Well, well," said the squire, somewhat mollified, "and Roger too. There I've been sending him here and sending him there all the afternoon."
"I didn't mind it, sir. I was only sorry you were so uneasy. I thought Osborne had gone home, for I knew it wasn't much in his way," said Roger. Molly intercepted a glance between the two brothers, a look of true confidence and love, which suddenly made her like them both, under the aspect of relationship, new to her observation. Roger came up to her, and sat down by her. "Well, and how are you getting on with Huber? Don't you find him very interesting?" "I'm afraid," said Molly, penitently, "I haven't read much. The Miss Brownings like me to talk, and besides, there is so much to do at home before papa comes back, and Miss Browning doesn't like me to go without her. I know it sounds nothing, but it does take up a great deal of time."
"When is your father coming back?"
"Next Tuesday, I believe. He cannot stay long away."
"I shall ride over and pay my respects to Mrs. Gibson," said he. "I shall come as soon as I may. Your father has been a very kind friend to me ever since I was a boy, and when I come I shall expect my pupil to have been very diligent," he concluded, smiling his kind, pleasant smile at idle Molly. Then the carriage came round, and she had the long solitary drive back to Miss Brownings'. It was dark out of doors when she got there, but Miss Phoebe was standing on the stairs, with a lighted candle in her hand, peering into the darkness to see Molly come in. "Oh, Molly, I thought you'd never come back. Such a piece of news! Sister has gone to bed. She's had a headache with the excitement, I think, but she says it's new bread. Come upstairs softly, my dear, and I'll tell you what it is. Who do you think has been here? Drinking tea with us, too, in the most condescending manner." "Lady Harriet?" said Molly, suddenly enlightened by the word condescending. "Yes. Why, how did you guess it? But after all, her call, at any rate in the first instance, was upon you. Oh, dear Molly, if you're not in a hurry to go to bed, let me sit down quietly and tell you all about it, for my heart jumps into my mouth still when I think of how I was caught. She, that is her ladyship,
left the carriage at the George, and took to her feet to go shopping, just as you or I may have done many a time in our lives. And sister was taking her 40 winks, and I was sitting with my gown up above my knees and my feet on the fender, pulling out my grandmother's lace which I'd been washing. The worst has yet to be told. I'd taken off my cap, for I thought it was getting dusk and no one would come, and there was I in my black silk skull-cap, when Nancy put her head in and whispered, "There's a lady downstairs, a real grand one by her talk," and in there came my Lady Harriet, so sweet and pretty in her ways, it was some time before I remembered I had never a cap on. Sister never wakened, or never roused up, so to say. She says she thought it was Nancy bringing in the tea when she heard some one moving, for her ladyship, as soon as she saw the state of the case, came and knelt down on the rug by me, and begged my pardon so prettily for having followed Nancy upstairs without waiting for permission, and was so taken by my old lace, and wanting to know how I washed it, and where you were, and when you'd be back, and when the happy couple would be back, till sister wakened. She's always a little bit put out, you know, when she first wakens from her afternoon nap, and without turning her head to see who it was, she said, quite sharp, "Buzz, buzz, buzz, when will you learn that whispering is more fidgeting than talking out loud? I've not been able to sleep at all for the chatter you and Nancy have been keeping up all this time. You know that was a little fancy of sister's, for she'd been snoring away as naturally as could be." So I went to her, and leaned over her, and said in a low voice, "Sister, it's her ladyship and me that has been conversing." "Ladyship here, ladyship there. Have you lost your wits, Phoebe, that you talk such nonsense, and in your skull-cap too?" By this time she was sitting up, and looking round her she saw Lady Harriet, in her velvets and silks, sitting on our rug, smiling, her bonnet off, and her pretty hair all bright with the blaze of the fire. My word! Sister was up on her feet directly, and she dropped her curtsy, and made her excuses for sleeping, as fast as might be, while I went off to put on my best cap, for sister might well say I was out of my wits to go on chatting to an earl's daughter, in an old black silk skull-cap. Black silk, too, when if I'd only known she was coming, I might have put on my new brown silk one, lying idle in my top drawer. And when I came back, sister was ordering tea for her ladyship, our tea, I mean. So I took my turn at talk, and sister slipped out to put on her Sunday silk. But I don't think we were quite so much at our ease with her ladyship as when I sat pulling out my lace in my skull-cap. And she was quite struck with our tea, and asked where we got it, for she never had tasted any like it before, and I told her we gave only 3 shillings 4 pence a pound for it, at Johnson's. Sister says I ought to have told her the price of our company tea, which is 5 shillings a pound, only that was not what we were drinking, for, as ill luck would have it, we'd none of it in the house. And she said she would send us some of hers, all the way from Russia or Prussia or some out-of-the-way place, and we were to compare, and see which we liked best, and if we liked hers best, she could get it for us at 3 shillings a pound. And she left her love for you, and though she was going away, you were not to forget her. Sister thought such a message would set you up too much, and told me she would not be chargeable for giving it you. But, I said, a message is a message, and it's on Molly's own shoulders if she's set up by it. Let us show her an example of humility, sister, though we have been sitting cheek by jowl in such company. So sister humphed, and said she'd a headache, and went to bed. And now you may tell me your news, my dear. So Molly told her small events, which, interesting as they might have been at other times to the gossip-loving and sympathetic Miss Phoebe, were rather pale in the stronger light reflected from the visit of an earl's daughter. End of chapter 14.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Kara Schallenberg. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 3. Molly Gibson's Childhood. 16 years before this time, all Hollingford had been disturbed to its foundations by the intelligence that Mr. Hall, the skilful doctor who had attended them all their days, was going to take a partner. It was no use reasoning to them on the subject, so Mr. Browning the vicar, Mr. Sheepshanks, Lord Cumnor's agent, and Mr. Hall himself, the masculine reasoners of the little society, left off the attempt, feeling that the que sera would prove more silencing to the murmurs than many arguments. Mr. Hall had told his faithful patients that, even with the strongest spectacles, his sight was not to be depended on, and they might have found out for themselves that his hearing was very defective, although on this point he obstinately adhered to his own opinion, and was frequently heard to regret the carelessness of people's communication nowadays. Like writing on blotting paper, all the words running into each other, he would say. And more than once Mr. Hall had had attacks of a suspicious nature. Rheumatism, he used to call them, but he prescribed for himself as if they had been gout, which had prevented his immediate attention to imperative summonses. But, blind and deaf, and rheumatic as he might be, he was still Mr. Hall, the doctor who could heal all their ailments, unless they died meanwhile, and he had no right to speak of growing old and taking a partner. He went very steadily to work all the same, advertising in medical journals, reading testimonials, sifting character and qualifications, and just when the elderly maiden ladies of Hollingford thought that they had convinced their contemporary that he was as young as ever, he startled them by bringing his new partner, Mr. Gibson, to call upon them, and began, slyly, as these ladies said, to introduce him into practice. And who was this Mr. Gibson, they asked, and Echo might answer the question if she liked, for no one else did. No one ever in all his life knew anything more of his antecedents than the Hollingford people might have found out the first day they saw him: that he was tall, grave, rather handsome than otherwise, thin enough to be called a very genteel figure in those days, before muscular Christianity had come into vogue, speaking with a slight Scotch accent, and, as one good lady observed, so very trite in his conversation, by which she meant sarcastic. As to his birth, parentage, and education, the favourite conjecture of Hollingford society was, that he was the illegitimate son of a Scotch duke by a Frenchwoman, and the grounds for this conjecture were these: he spoke with a Scotch accent, therefore he must be Scotch. He had a very genteel appearance, an elegant figure, and was apt, so his ill-wishers said, to give himself airs. Therefore his father must have been some person of quality, and that granted, nothing was easier than to run this supposition up all the notes of the scale of the peerage: baronet, baron, viscount, earl, marquis, duke. Higher they dared not go, though one old lady, acquainted with English history, hazarded the remark that she believed that one or two of the Stuarts had not always been quite correct in their conduct, and she fancied such things ran in families. But in popular opinion Mr. Gibson's father always remained a duke, nothing more. Then his mother must have been a Frenchwoman, because his hair was so black, and he was so sallow, and because he had been in Paris. All this might be true, or might not. Nobody ever knew, or found out anything more about him than what Mr. Hall told them, namely, that his professional qualifications were as high as his moral character, and that both were far above the average, as Mr. Hall had taken pains to ascertain before introducing him to his patients. The popularity of this world is as transient as its glory, as Mr. Hall found out before the first year of his partnership was over. He had plenty of leisure left to him now to nurse his gout and cherish his eyesight. The younger doctor had carried the day. Nearly every one sent for Mr. Gibson now, even at the great houses, even at the Towers, that greatest of all, where Mr. Hall had introduced his new partner with fear and trembling, with untold anxiety as to his behaviour, and the impression he might make on my lord the Earl and my lady the Countess. Mr. Gibson was received at the end of a twelvemonth with as much welcome respect for his professional skill as Mr. Hall himself had ever been. Nay, and this was a little too much for even the kind old doctor's good temper, Mr. Gibson had even been invited once to dinner at the Towers, to dine with the great Sir Astley, the head of the profession. To be sure, Mr. Hall had been asked as well, but he was laid up just then with his gout. Since he had had a partner, the rheumatism had been allowed to develop itself, and he had not been able to go. Poor Mr. Hall never quite got over this mortification. After it, he allowed himself to become dim of sight and hard of hearing, and kept pretty closely to the house during the 2 winters that remained of his life. He sent for an orphan grandniece to keep him company in his old age. He, the woman-contemning old bachelor, became thankful for the cheerful presence of the pretty, bonny Mary Preston, who was good and sensible, and nothing more. She formed a close friendship with the daughters of the vicar, Mr. Browning, and Mr. Gibson found time to become very intimate with all 3. Hollingford speculated much on which young lady would become Mrs. Gibson, and was rather sorry when the talk about possibilities and the gossip about probabilities with regard to the handsome young surgeon's marriage ended in the most natural manner in the world, by his marrying his predecessor's niece. The 2 Miss Brownings showed no signs of going into a consumption on the occasion, although their looks and manners were carefully watched. On the contrary, they were rather boisterously merry at the wedding, and poor Mrs. Gibson it was that died of consumption, 4 or 5 years after her marriage, 3 years after the death of her great-uncle, and when her only child, Molly, was just 3 years old. Mr. Gibson did not speak much about the grief at the loss of his wife, which it is to be supposed that he felt. Instead, he avoided all demonstration of sympathy, and got up hastily and left the room when Miss Phoebe Browning first saw him after his loss, and burst into an uncontrollable flood of tears, which threatened to end in hysterics. Miss Browning afterwards said she never could forgive him for his hard-heartedness on that occasion, but a fortnight afterwards she came to very high words with old Mrs. Goodenough for gasping out her doubts whether Mr. Gibson was a man of deep feeling, judging by the narrowness of his crape hatband, which ought to have covered his hat, whereas there was at least 3 inches of beaver to be seen. And, in spite of it all, Miss Browning and Miss Phoebe considered themselves as Mr. Gibson's most intimate friends, in right of their regard for his dead wife, and would fain have taken a quasi-motherly interest in his little girl, had she not been guarded by a watchful dragon in the shape of Betty, her nurse, who was jealous of any interference between her and her charge, and especially resentful and disagreeable towards all those ladies who, by suitable age, rank, or propinquity, she thought capable of casting sheep's eyes at master. Several years before the opening of this story, Mr. Gibson's position seemed settled for life, both socially and professionally. He was a widower, and likely to remain so. His domestic affections were centred on little Molly, but even to her, in their most private moments, he did not give way to much expression of his feelings. His most caressing appellation for her was Goosey, and he took a pleasure in bewildering her infant mind with his badinage. He had rather a contempt for demonstrative people, arising from his medical insight into the consequences to health of uncontrolled feeling. He deceived himself into believing that still his reason was lord of all, because he had never fallen into the habit of expression on any other than purely intellectual subjects. Molly, however, had her own intuitions to guide her. Though her papa laughed at her, quizzed her, joked at her, in a way which the Miss Brownings called really cruel to each other when they were quite alone, Molly took her little griefs and pleasures and poured them into her papa's ears, sooner even than into Betty's, that kind-hearted termagant. The child grew to understand her father well, and the 2 had the most delightful intercourse together, half banter, half seriousness, but altogether confidential friendship. Mr. Gibson kept 3 servants, Betty, a cook, and a girl who was supposed to be housemaid, but who was under both the elder 2, and had a pretty life of it in consequence. 3 servants would not have been required if it had not been Mr. Gibson's habit, as it had been Mr. Hall's before him, to take 2 pupils, as they were called in the genteel language of Hollingford, apprentices as they were in fact, being bound by indentures and paying a handsome premium to learn their business. They lived in the house, and occupied an uncomfortable, ambiguous, or, as Miss Browning called it with some truth, amphibious position. They had their meals with Mr. Gibson and Molly, and were felt to be terribly in the way. Mr. Gibson not being a man who could make conversation, and hating the duty of talking under restraint. Yet something within him made him wince, as if his duties were not rightly performed, when, as the cloth was drawn, the two awkward lads rose up with joyful alacrity, gave him a nod, which was to be interpreted as a bow, knocked against each other in their endeavours to get out of the dining-room quickly, and then might be heard dashing along a passage which led to the surgery, choking with half-suppressed laughter. Yet the annoyance he felt at this dull sense of imperfectly fulfilled duties only made his sarcasms on their inefficiency or stupidity or ill manners more bitter than before. Beyond direct professional instruction, he did not know what to do with the succession of pairs of young men, whose mission seemed to be to plague their master consciously and to plague him unconsciously. Once or twice Mr. Gibson had declined taking a fresh pupil, in the hopes of shaking himself free from the incubus, but his reputation as a clever surgeon had spread so rapidly that fees which he had thought prohibitory were willingly paid, in order that the young man might make a start in life, with the prestige of having been a pupil of Gibson of Hollingford. But as Molly grew to be a little girl instead of a child, when she was about 8 years old, her father perceived the awkwardness of her having her breakfasts and dinners so often alone with the pupils, without his uncertain presence. To do away with this evil, more than for the actual instruction she could give, he engaged a respectable woman, the daughter of a shopkeeper in the town, who had left a destitute family, to come every morning before breakfast, and to stay with Molly till he came home at night, or, if he was detained, until the child's bedtime. "Now, Miss Eyre," said he, summing up his instructions the day before she entered upon her office, "remember this: you are to make good tea for the young men, and see that they have their meals comfortably, and you are 35, I think you said? Try and make them talk. Rationally, I am afraid, is beyond your or anybody's power, but make them talk without stammering or giggling. Don't teach Molly too much. She must sew and read and write and do her sums, but I want to keep her a child, and if I find more learning desirable for her, I'll see about giving it to her myself. After all, I am not sure that reading or writing is necessary. Many a good woman gets married with only a cross instead of her name. It's rather a diluting of mother-wit to my fancy, but, however, we must yield to the prejudices of society, Miss Eyre, and so you may teach the child to read." Miss Eyre listened in silence, perplexed but determined to be obedient to the directions of the doctor, whose kindness she and her family had good cause to know. She made strong tea. She helped the young men liberally in Mr. Gibson's absence, as well as in his presence, and she found the way to unloosen their tongues, whenever their master was away, by talking to them on trivial subjects in her pleasant homely way. She taught Molly to read and write, but tried honestly to keep her back in every other branch of education. It was only by fighting and struggling hard that, bit by bit, Molly persuaded her father to let her have French and drawing lessons. He was always afraid of her becoming too much educated, though he need not have been alarmed. The masters who visited such small country towns as Hollingford 40 years ago were no such great proficients in their arts. Once a week she joined a dancing class in the assembly room at the principal inn in the town, the George, and being daunted by her father in every intellectual attempt, she read every book that came in her way, almost with as much delight as if it had been forbidden. For his station in life, Mr. Gibson had an unusually good library. The medical portion of it was inaccessible to Molly, being kept in the surgery, but every other book she had either read or tried to read. Her summer place of study was that seat in the cherry-tree, where she got the green stains on her frock that have already been mentioned as likely to wear Betty's life out. In spite of this hidden worm in the bud, Betty was to all appearance strong, alert, and flourishing. She was the one crook in Miss Eyre's lot, who was otherwise so happy in having met with a suitable, well-paid employment just when she needed it most. But Betty, though agreeing in theory with her master when he told her of the necessity of having a governess for his little daughter, was vehemently opposed to any division of her authority and influence over the child who had been her charge, her plague, and her delight ever since Mrs. Gibson's death. She took up her position as censor of all Miss Eyre's sayings and doings from the very first, and did not for a moment condescend to conceal her disapprobation. In her heart she could not help respecting the patience and painstaking of the good lady, for a lady Miss Eyre was in the best sense of the word, though in Hollingford she only took rank as a shopkeeper's daughter. Yet Betty buzzed about her with the teasing pertinacity of a gnat, always ready to find fault, if not to bite. Miss Eyre's only defence came from the quarter whence it might least have been expected, from her pupil, on whose fancied behalf, as an oppressed little personage, Betty always based her attacks. But very early in the day Molly perceived their injustice, and soon afterwards she began to respect Miss Eyre for her silent endurance of what evidently gave her far more pain than Betty imagined. Mr. Gibson had been a friend in need to her family, so Miss Eyre restrained her complaints sooner than annoy him. And she had her reward. Betty would offer Molly all sorts of small temptations to neglect Miss Eyre's wishes. Molly steadily resisted, and plodded away at her task of sewing or her difficult sum. Betty made cumbrous jokes at Miss Eyre's expense. Molly looked up with the utmost gravity, as if requesting the explanation of an unintelligible speech, and there is nothing so quenching to a wag as to be asked to translate his jest into plain matter-of-fact English, and to show wherein the point lies. Occasionally Betty lost her temper entirely, and spoke impertinently to Miss Eyre, but when this had been done in Molly's presence, the girl flew out into such a violent passion of words in defence of her silent, trembling governess, that even Betty herself was daunted, though she chose to take the child's anger as a good joke, and tried to persuade Miss Eyre herself to join in her amusement. "Bless the child! One would think I was a hungry pussy-cat, and she a hen-sparrow, with her wings all fluttering, and her little eyes aflame, and her beak ready to peck me, just because I happened to look near her nest. Nay, child, if thou likest to be stifled in a nasty close room, learning things as is of no earthly good when they is learnt, instead o' riding on Job Donkin's hay-cart, it's thy lookout, not mine. She's a little vixen, isn't she?" smiling at Miss Eyre as she finished her speech. But the poor governess saw no humour in the affair. The comparison of Molly to a hen-sparrow was lost upon her. She was sensitive and conscientious, and knew, from home experience, the evils of an ungovernable temper. So she began to reprove Molly for giving way to her passion, and the child thought it hard to be blamed for what she considered her just anger against Betty. But, after all, these were the small grievances of a very happy childhood. End of Chapter 3. Read by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org, on October 7th, 2006, in Oceanside, California.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 13. Molly Gibson's New Friends. Time was speeding on. It was now the middle of August. If anything was to be done to the house, it must be done at once. Indeed, in several ways Mr. Gibson's arrangements with Miss Browning had not been made too soon. The squire had heard that Osborne might probably return home for a few days before going abroad, and, Though the growing intimacy between Roger and Molly did not alarm him in the least, yet he was possessed by a very hearty panic lest the heir might take a fancy to the surgeon's daughter, and he was in such a fidget for her to leave the house before Osborne came home, that his wife lived in constant terror lest he should make it too obvious to their visitor. Every young girl of 17 or so, who is at all thoughtful, is very apt to make a pope out of the first person who presents to her a new or larger system of duty than that by which she has been unconsciously guided hitherto. Such a pope was Roger to Molly. She looked to his opinion, to his authority on almost every subject, yet he had only said one or two things in a terse manner which gave them the force of precepts, stable guides to her conduct, and had shown the natural superiority in wisdom and knowledge which is sure to exist between a highly educated young man of no common intelligence and an ignorant girl of 17, who yet was well capable of appreciation. Still, although they were drawn together in this very pleasant relationship, each was imagining some one very different for the future owner of their whole heart, their highest and completest love. Roger looked to find a grand woman, his equal and his empress, beautiful in person, serene in wisdom, ready for counsel, as was Egeria. Molly's little wavering maiden fancy dwelt on the unseen Osborne, who was now a troubadour, and now a knight, such as he wrote about in one of his own poems, some one like Osborne, perhaps, rather than Osborne himself, for she shrank from giving a personal form and name to the hero that was to be. The squire was not unwise in wishing her well out of the house before Osborne came home, if he was considering her peace of mind. Yet, when she went away from the Hall he missed her constantly. It had been so pleasant to have her there, daily fulfilling all the pretty offices of a daughter, cheering the meals, so often tete-a-tete betwixt him and Roger, with her innocent wise questions, her lively interest in their talk, her merry replies to his banter. And Roger missed her too. Sometimes her remarks had probed into his mind, and excited him to the deep thought in which he delighted. At other times he had felt himself of real help to her in her hours of need, and in making her take an interest in books, which treated of higher things than the continual fiction and poetry which she had hitherto read. He felt something like an affectionate tutor who was suddenly deprived of his most promising pupil. He wondered how she would go on without him, whether she would be puzzled and disheartened by the books he had lent her to read, how she and her stepmother would get along together. She occupied his thoughts a good deal those first few days after she left the Hall. Mrs. Hamley regretted her more and longer than did the other two. She had given her the place of a daughter in her heart, and now she missed the sweet feminine companionship, the playful caresses, the never-ceasing attentions, the very need of sympathy in her sorrows, that Molly had shown so openly from time to time. All these things had extremely endeared her to the tender-hearted Mrs. Hamley. Molly, too, felt the change of atmosphere keenly, and she blamed herself for so feeling even more keenly still. But she could not help having a sense of refinement, which had made her appreciate the whole manner of being at the Hall. By her dear old friends the Miss Brownings she was petted and caressed so much that she became ashamed of noticing the coarser and louder tones in which they spoke, the provincialism of their pronunciation, the absence of interest in things, and their greediness of details about persons. They asked her questions which she was puzzled enough to answer about her future stepmother, her loyalty to her father forbidding her to reply fully and truthfully. She was always glad when they began to make inquiries as to every possible affair at the Hall. She had been so happy there. She liked them all, down to the very dogs, so thoroughly that it was easy work replying. She did not mind telling them everything, even to the style of Mrs. Hamley's invalid dress, nor what wine the squire drank at dinner. Indeed, talking about these things helped her to recall the happiest time in her life. But one evening, as they were all sitting together after tea in the little upstairs drawing-room, looking into the High Street, Molly discoursing away on the various pleasures of Hamley Hall, and just then telling of all Roger's wisdom in natural science, and some of the curiosities he had shown her, she was suddenly pulled up by this little speech. "You seem to have seen a great deal of Mr. Roger, Molly," said Miss Browning, in a way intended to convey a great deal of meaning to her sister and none at all to Molly. But "the man recovered of the bite, the dog it was that died." Molly was perfectly aware of Miss Browning's emphatic tone, though at first she was perplexed as to its cause, while Miss Phoebe was just then too much absorbed in knitting the heel of her stocking to be fully alive to her sister's nods and winks. "Yes, he was very kind to me," said Molly, slowly, pondering over Miss Browning's manner, and unwilling to say more until she had satisfied herself to what the question tended. "I dare say you will be soon going to Hamley Hall again. He is not the eldest son, you know, Phoebe. Don't make my head ache with your eternal 1819, but attend to the conversation. Molly is telling us how much she saw of Mr. Roger, and how kind he was to her. I've always heard he was a very nice young man, my dear. Tell us some more about him. Now, Phoebe, attend. How was he kind to you, Molly?" "Oh, he told me what books to read, and one day he made me notice how many bees I saw." "Bees, child? What do you mean? Either you or he must have been crazy." "No, not at all. There are more than 200 kinds of bees in England, and he wanted me to notice the difference between them and flies. Miss Browning, I can't help seeing what you fancy," said Molly, as red as fire, "but it is very wrong. It is all a mistake. I won't speak another word about Mr. Roger or Hamley at all, if it puts such silly notions into your head." "Highty-tighty! Here's a young lady to be lecturing her elders. Silly notions, indeed! They are in your head, it seems. And let me tell you, Molly, you are too young to let your mind be running on lovers." Molly had been once or twice called saucy and impertinent, and certainly a little sauciness came out now. "I never said what this silly notion was, Miss Browning, did I now, Miss Phoebe? Don't you see, dear Miss Phoebe, it is all her own interpretation, and according to her own fancy, this foolish talk about lovers?" Molly was flaming with indignation, but she had appealed to the wrong person for justice. Miss Phoebe tried to make peace after the fashion of weak-minded persons, who would cover over the unpleasant sight of a sore, instead of trying to heal it. "I'm sure I don't know anything about it, my dear. It seems to me that what Sally was saying is very true indeed, and I think, love, you misunderstood her, or perhaps she misunderstood you, or I may be misunderstanding it altogether, so we'd better not talk any more about it. What price did you say you were going to give for the drugget in Mr. Gibson's dining-room, sister?" So Miss Browning and Molly went on till evening, each chafed and angry with the other. They wished each other good night, going through the usual forms in the coolest manner possible. Molly went up to her little bedroom, clean and neat as a bedroom could be, with draperies of small delicate patchwork, bed curtains, window curtains, and counterpane, a japanned toilette table, full of little boxes, with a small looking-glass affixed to it, that distorted every face that was so unwise as to look in it. This room had been to the child one of the most dainty and luxurious places ever seen, in comparison with her own bare, white dimity bedroom, and now she was sleeping in it, as a guest, and all the quaint adornments she had once peeped at as a great favour, as they were carefully wrapped up in cap paper, were set out for her use. And yet how little she had deserved this hospitable care, how impertinent she had been, how cross she had felt ever since. She was crying tears of penitence and youthful misery when there came a low tap to the door. Molly opened it, and there stood Miss Browning, in a wonderful erection of a nightcap, and scantily attired in a coloured calico jacket over her scrimpy and short white petticoat. "I was afraid you were asleep, child," said she, coming in and shutting the door, "but I wanted to say to you what we've got wrong to-day somehow, and I think it was perhaps my doing. It's as well Phoebe shouldn't know, for she thinks me perfect, and when there's only two of us, we get along better if one of us thinks the other can do no wrong. But I rather think I was a little cross. We'll not say any more about it, Molly, only we'll go to sleep friends, and friends we'll always be, child, won't we? Now give me a kiss, and don't cry and swell your eyes up, and put out your candle carefully." I was wrong. It was my fault," said Molly, kissing her.
"Fiddlestick-ends, don't contradict me. I say it was my fault, and I won't hear another word about it."
The next day Molly went with Miss Browning to see the changes going on in her father's house. To her they were but dismal improvements. The faint grey of the dining-room walls, which had harmonized well enough with the deep crimson of the moreen curtains, and which, when well cleaned, looked thinly coated rather than dirty, was now exchanged for a pink salmon colour of a very glowing hue, and the new curtains were of that pale sea-green just coming into fashion. Very bright and pretty, Miss Browning called it, and in the first renewing of their love Molly could not bear to contradict her. She could only hope that the green and brown drugget would tone down the brightness and prettiness. There was scaffolding here, scaffolding there, and Betty scolding everywhere. "Come up now and see your papa's bedroom. He's sleeping upstairs in yours, that everything may be done up afresh in his." Molly could just remember, in faint clear lines of distinctness, being taken into this very room to bid farewell to her dying mother. She could see the white linen, the white muslin, surrounding the pale, wan, wistful face, with the large, longing eyes, yearning for one more touch of the little soft, warm child, whom she was too feeble to clasp in her arms, already growing numb in death. Many a time when Molly had been in this room since that sad day, had she seen in vivid fancy that same wan, wistful face lying on the pillow, the outline of the form beneath the clothes, and the girl had not shrunk from such visions, but rather cherished them, as preserving to her the remembrance of her mother's outward semblance. Her eyes were full of tears, as she followed Miss Browning into this room to see it under its new aspect. Nearly everything was changed, the position of the bed and the colour of the furniture. There was a grand toilette table now, with a glass upon it, instead of the primitive substitute of the top of a chest of drawers, with a mirror above on the wall sloping downwards. These latter things had served her mother during her short married life.
"You see we must have all in order for a lady who has passed so much of her time in the Countess's mansion," said Miss Browning, who was now quite reconciled to the marriage, thanks to the pleasant employment of furnishing that had devolved upon her in consequence. "Cromer, the upholsterer, wanted to persuade me to have a sofa and a writing-table. These men will say anything is the fashion, if they want to sell an article. I said, 'No, no, Cromer, bedrooms are for sleeping in, and sitting-rooms are for sitting in. Keep everything to its right purpose, and don't try and delude me into nonsense.' Why, my mother would have given us a fine scolding if she had ever caught us in our bedrooms in the daytime. We kept our outdoor things in a closet downstairs, and there was a very tidy place for washing our hands, which is as much as one wants in the daytime. Stuffing up a bedroom with sofas and tables! I never heard of such a thing. Besides, £100 won't last forever. I shan't be able to do anything for your room, Molly."
"I'm right down glad of it," said Molly. "Nearly everything in it was what mamma had when she lived with my great-uncle. I wouldn't have had it changed for the world, I am so fond of it."
"Well, there's no danger of it, now the money is run out. By the way, Molly, who's to buy you a bridesmaid's dress?"
"I don't know," said Molly. "I suppose I am to be a bridesmaid, but no one has spoken to me about my dress."
"Then I shall ask your papa."
"Please don't. He must have to spend a great deal of money just now. Besides, I would rather not be at the wedding, if they'll let me stay away."
"Nonsense, child! Why, all the town would be talking of it. You must go, and you must be well dressed, for your father's sake."
But Mr. Gibson had thought of Molly's dress, although he had said nothing about it to her. He had commissioned his future wife to get her what was requisite, and presently a very smart dressmaker came over from the county town to try on a dress, which was both so simple and so elegant as at once to charm Molly. When it came home all ready to put on, Molly had a private dressing up for the Miss Brownings' benefit, and she was almost startled when she looked into the glass and saw the improvement in her appearance. "I wonder if I'm pretty," thought she. "I almost think I am, in this kind of dress, I mean, of course. Betty would say, 'Fine feathers make fine birds.'" When she went downstairs in her bridal attire, and with shy blushes presented herself for inspection, she was greeted with a burst of admiration. "Well, upon my word, I shouldn't have known you!" Fine feathers, thought Molly, and checked her rising vanity. "You are really beautiful, isn't she, sister?" said Miss Phoebe. "Why, my dear, if you were always dressed, you would be prettier than your dear mamma, whom we always reckoned so very personable." "You're not a bit like her. You favor your father, and white always sets off a brown complexion." "But isn't she beautiful?" persevered Miss Phoebe. "Well, and if she is, Providence made her, and not she herself. Besides, the dressmaker must go shares. What a fine India muslin it is! It'll have cost a pretty penny." Mr. Gibson and Molly drove over to Ashcombe, the night before the wedding, in the one yellow post-chaise that Hollingford possessed. They were to be Mr. Preston's, or rather my lord's, guests at the manor-house. The manor-house came up to its name, and delighted Molly at first sight. It was built of stone, had many gables and mullioned windows, and was covered over with Virginian creeper and late-blowing roses. Molly did not know Mr. Preston, who stood in the doorway to greet her father. She took standing with him as a young lady at once, and it was the first time she had met with the kind of behaviour, half complimentary, half flirting, which some men think it is necessary to assume with every woman under 25. Mr. Preston was very handsome, and knew it. He was a fair man, with light brown hair and whiskers, grey, roving, well-shaped eyes, with lashes darker than his hair, and a figure rendered easy and supple by the athletic exercises in which his excellence was famous, and which had procured him admission into much higher society than he was otherwise entitled to enter. He was a capital cricketer, was so good a shot that any house desirous of a reputation for its bags on the 12th or the 1st was glad to have him for a guest. He taught young ladies to play billiards on a wet day, or went in for the game in serious earnest when required. He knew half the private theatrical plays off by heart, and was invaluable in arranging impromptu charades and tableaux. He had his own private reasons for wishing to get up a flirtation with Molly just at this time. He had amused himself so much with the widow when she first came to Ashcombe, that he fancied that the sight of him, standing by her less polished, less handsome, middle-aged husband, might be too much of a contrast to be agreeable. Besides, he had really a strong passion for someone else, someone who would be absent, and that passion it was necessary for him to conceal. So that, altogether, he had resolved, even had the little Gibson girl, as he called her, been less attractive than she was, to devote himself to her for the next 16 hours. They were taken by their host into a wainscoted parlour, where a wood fire crackled and burnt, and the crimson curtains shut out the waning day and the outer chill. Here the table was laid for dinner, snowy table linen, bright silver, clear sparkling glass, wine, and an autumnal dessert on the sideboard. Yet Mr. Preston kept apologizing to Molly for the rudeness of his bachelor home, for the smallness of the room, the great dining-room being already appropriated by his housekeeper, in preparation for the morrow's breakfast. And then he rang for a servant to show Molly to her room. She was taken into a most comfortable chamber, a wood fire on the hearth, candles lighted on the toilette table, dark woolen curtains surrounding a snow-white bed, great vases of china standing here and there. "This is my Lady Harriet's room when her ladyship comes to the manor-house with my lord the Earl," said the housemaid, striking out thousands of brilliant sparks by a well-directed blow at a smouldering log. "Shall I help you to dress, miss? I always help her ladyship." Molly, quite aware of the fact that she had but her white muslin gown for the wedding besides that she had on, dismissed the good woman, and was thankful to be left to herself. Dinner, was it called? Why, it was nearly 8 o'clock, and preparations for bed seemed a more natural employment than dressing at this hour of night. All the dressing she could manage was the placing of a red damask rose or two in the band of her grey stuff gown, there being a great nosegay of choice autumnal flowers on the toilette table. She did try the effect of another crimson rose in her black hair, just above her ear. It was very pretty, but too coquettish, and so she put it back again. The dark oak panels and wainscoting of the whole house seemed to glow in warm light. There were so many fires in different rooms, in the hall, and even one on the landing of the staircase. Mr. Preston must have heard her step, for he met her in the hall, and led her into a small drawing-room, with closed folding doors on one side, opening into the larger drawing-room, as he told her. This room into which she entered reminded her a little of Hamley, yellow satin upholstery of 70 or 100 years ago, all delicately kept and scrupulously clean, great Indian cabinets and china jars, emitting spicy odors, a large blazing fire, before which her father stood in his morning dress, grave and thoughtful, as he had been all day.
This room is that which Lady Harrison uses when she comes here with her father for a day or two, said Mr. Preston, and Molly tried to save her father by being ready to talk herself.
Does she often come here?
Not often, but I fancy she likes being here when she does. Perhaps she finds it an agreeable change after the more formal life she leads at the Towers.
I should think it was a very pleasant house to stay at, said Molly, remembering the look of warm comfort that pervaded it. But a little to her dismay, Mr. Preston seemed to take it as a compliment to himself.
I was afraid a young lady like you might perceive all the incongruities of a bachelor's home. I am very much obliged to you, Miss Gibson. In general, I live pretty much in the room in which we shall dine, and I have a sort of agent's office in which I keep books and papers and receive callers on business.
Then they went in to dinner. Molly thought everything that was served was delicious, and cooked to the point of perfection, but they did not seem to satisfy Mr. Preston, who apologized to his guests several times for the bad cooking of this dish, or the omission of a particular sauce to that, always referring to bachelor's housekeeping, bachelor's this, and bachelor's that, till Molly grew quite impatient at the word. Her father's depression, which was still continuing and rendering him very silent, made her uneasy, yet she wished to conceal it from Mr. Preston, and so she talked away, trying to obviate the sort of personal bearing which their host would give to everything. She did not know when to leave the gentleman, but her father made a sign to her, and she was conducted back to the yellow drawing-room by Mr. Preston, who made many apologies for leaving her there. She enjoyed herself extremely, however, feeling at liberty to prowl about, and examine all the curiosities the room contained. Among other things was a Louis XV cabinet, with lovely miniatures in enamel let into the fine woodwork. She carried a candle to it, and was looking intently at these faces when her father and Mr. Preston came in. Her father looked still careworn and anxious. He came up and patted her on the back, looked at what she was looking at, and then went off to silence and the fire. Mr. Preston took the candle out of her hand and threw himself into her interests with an air of ready gallantry.
That is said to be Mademoiselle de Saint-Quentin, a great beauty at the French court. This is Madame du Barry. Do you see any likeness in Mademoiselle de Saint-Quentin to anyone you know?
He had lowered his voice a little as he asked this question. No, said Molly, looking at it again. I never saw anyone half so beautiful.
But don't you see a likeness, in the eyes particularly? He asked again, with some impatience.
Molly tried hard to find out a resemblance, and was again unsuccessful.
It constantly reminds me of Miss Kirkpatrick.
Does it? Said Molly, eagerly. Oh, I am so glad! I've never seen her, so of course I couldn't find out the likeness. You know her then, do you? Please tell me all about her. He hesitated a moment before speaking. He smiled a little before replying.
She's very beautiful. That, of course, is understood when I say that this miniature does not come up to her for beauty.
And besides? Go on, please.
What do you mean by besides?
Oh, I suppose she's very clever and accomplished? That was not in the least what Molly wanted to ask, but it was difficult to word the vague vastness of her unspoken inquiry.
She is clever, naturally. She has picked up accomplishments. But she has such a charm about her. One forgets what she herself is in the halo that surrounds her. You ask me all this, Miss Gibson, and I answer truthfully, or else I should not entertain one young lady with my enthusiastic praises of another." "I don't see why not," said Molly. "Besides, if you wouldn't do it in general, I think you ought to do it in my case. For you, perhaps, don't know, but she is coming to live with us when she leaves school, and we are very nearly the same age, so it will be almost like having a sister." "She is to live with you, is she?" said Mr. Preston, to whom this intelligence was news. "And when is she to leave school? I thought she would surely have been at this wedding, but I was told she was not to come. When is she to leave school?" "I think it is to be at Easter. You know she's at Bologna, and it's a long journey for her to come alone, or else papa wished for her to be at the marriage very much indeed." "And her mother prevented it? I understand." "No, it wasn't her mother. It was the French schoolmistress, who didn't think it desirable." "It comes to pretty much the same thing. And she's to return and live with you after Easter." "I believe so. Is she a grave or a merry person?" "Never very grave as far as I have seen of her. Sparkling would be the word for her, I think. Do you ever write to her? If you do, pray remember me to her, and tell her how we have been talking about her, you and I." "I never write to her," said Molly, rather shortly. Tea came in, and after that they all went to bed. Molly heard her father exclaim at the fire in his bedroom, and Mr. Preston's reply. "I pique myself on my keen relish for all creature comforts, and also on my power of doing without them, if need be. My lord's woods are ample, and I indulge myself with a fire in my bedroom for 9 months of the year. Yet I could travel in Iceland without wincing from the cold." End of chapter 13.
Chapter 54 of Wives and Daughters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 54. Molly Gibson's Worth is Discovered. Mr. Gibson came in rubbing his hands after his frosty ride. Molly judged from the look in his eye that he had been fully informed of the present state of things at the Hall by some one. But he simply went up to and greeted the Squire, and waited to hear what was said to him. The Squire was fumbling at the taper on the writing-table, and before he answered much he lighted it, and signing to his friend to follow him, he went softly to the sofa and showed him the sleeping child, taking the utmost care not to arouse it by flare or sound. "Well, this is a fine young gentleman," said Mr. Gibson, returning to the fire rather sooner than the Squire expected. "And you've got the mother here, I understand. Mrs. Osborne Hamley, as we must call her. Poor thing! It's a sad coming home to her, for I hear she knew nothing of his death." He spoke without exactly addressing any one, so that either Molly or the Squire might answer as they liked. The Squire said, "Yes, she has felt it a terrible shock. She's upstairs in the best bedroom. I should like you to see her, Gibson, if she'll let you. We must do our duty by her, for my poor lad's sake. I wish he could have seen his boy lying there, I do. I daresay it preyed on him to have to keep it all to himself. He might ha' known me, though. He might ha' known my bark was waur than my bite. It's all over now, though, and God forgive me if I was too sharp. I'm punished now." Molly grew impatient on the mother's behalf. "Papa, I feel as if she was very ill, perhaps worse than we think. Will you go and see her at once?" Mr. Gibson followed her upstairs, and the Squire came too, thinking that he would do his duty now, and even feeling some self-satisfaction at conquering his desire to stay with the child. They went into the room where she had been taken. She lay quite still in the same position as at first. Her eyes were open and tearless, fixed on the wall. Mr. Gibson spoke to her, but she did not answer. He lifted her hand to feel her pulse. She never noticed. "Bring me some wine at once, and order some beef tea," he said to Molly. But when he tried to put the wine into her mouth as she lay there on her side, she made no effort to receive or swallow it, and it ran out upon the pillow. Mr. Gibson left the room abruptly. Molly chafed the little inanimate hand. The Squire stood by in dumb dismay, touched in spite of himself by the death and life of one so young, and who must have been so much beloved. Mr. Gibson came back 2 steps at a time, and he was carrying the half awakened child in his arms. He did not scruple to rouse him into yet further wakefulness, did not grieve to hear him begin to wail and cry. His eyes were on the figure upon the bed, which at that sound quivered all through, and when her child was laid at her back, and began caressingly to scramble yet closer, AimÄe turned round and took him to her arms, and lulled him and soothed him with the soft want of mother's love. Before she lost this faint consciousness, which was habit or instinct rather than thought, Mr. Gibson spoke to her in French. The child's one word of "Maman" had given him this clue. It was the language sure to be most intelligible to her dulled brain, and, as it happened, only Mr. Gibson did not think of that. It was the language in which she had been commanded, and had learnt to obey. Mr. Gibson's tongue was a little stiff at first, but by and by he spoke it with all his old readiness. He extorted from her short answers at first, then longer ones, and from time to time he plied her with little drops of wine, until some further nourishment should be at hand. Molly was struck by her father's low tones of comfort and sympathy, although she could not follow what was said quickly enough to catch the meaning of what passed. By and by, however, when her father had done all that he could, and they were once more downstairs, he told them more about her journey than they yet knew. The hurry, the sense of acting in defiance of a prohibition, the overmastering anxiety, the broken night, and fatigue of the journey, had ill prepared her for the shock at last, and Mr. Gibson was seriously alarmed for the consequences. She had wandered strangely in her replies to him, had perceived that she was wandering, and had made great efforts to recall her senses. But Mr. Gibson foresaw that some bodily illness was coming on, and stopped late that night arranging many things with Molly and the Squire. One, the only comfort arising from her state, was the probability that she would be entirely unconscious by the morrow, the day of the funeral. Worn out by the contending emotions of the day, the Squire seemed now unable to look beyond the wrench and trial of the next 12 hours. He sat with his head in his hands, declining to go to bed, refusing to dwell on the thought of his grandchild, not 3 hours ago such a darling in his eyes. Mr. Gibson gave some instructions to one of the maid servants as to the watch she was to keep by Mrs. Osborne Hamley, and insisted on Molly's going to bed. When she pleaded the apparent necessity of her staying up, he said, "Now, Molly, look how much less trouble the dear old Squire would give if he would obey orders. He is only adding to anxiety by indulging himself. One pardons everything to extreme grief, however. But you will have enough to do to occupy all your strength for days to come, and go to bed you must now. I only wish I saw my way as clearly through other things as I do to your nearest duty. I wish I'd never let Roger go wandering off. He'll wish it too, poor fellow. Did I tell you Cynthia is going off in hot haste to her uncle Kirkpatrick's? I suspect a visit to him will stand in lieu of going out to Russia as a governess. I am sure she was quite serious in wishing for that. Yes, yes, at the time. I've no doubt she thought she was sincere in intending to go, but the great thing was to get out of the unpleasantness of the present time and place, and uncle Kirkpatrick's will do this as effectually and more pleasantly than a situation at Nizhni Novgorod in an ice palace." He had given Molly's thoughts a turn, which was what he wanted to do. Molly could not help remembering Mr. Henderson and his offer, and all the consequent hints, and wondering and wishing. What did she wish? Or had she been falling asleep? Before she had quite ascertained this point she was asleep in reality. After this, long days passed over in a monotonous round of care, for no one seemed to think of Molly's leaving the Hall during the woeful illness that befell Mrs. Osborne Hamley. It was not that her father allowed her to take much active part in the nursing. The Squire gave him carte blanche, and he engaged 2 efficient hospital nurses to watch over the unconscious AimÄe. But Molly was needed to receive the finer directions as to her treatment and diet. It was not that she was wanted for the care of the little boy. The Squire was too jealous of the child's exclusive love for that, and one of the housemaids was employed in the actual physical charge of him; but he needed some one to listen to his incontinence of language, both when his passionate regret for his dead son came uppermost, and also when he had discovered some extraordinary charm in that son's child, and again when he was oppressed with the uncertainty of AimÄe's long-continued illness. Molly was not so good or so bewitching a listener to ordinary conversation as Cynthia, but where her heart was interested her sympathy was deep and unfailing. In this case she only wished that the Squire could really feel that AimÄe was not the encumbrance which he evidently considered her to be. Not that he would have acknowledged the fact if it had been put before him in plain words. He fought against the dim consciousness of what was in his mind. He spoke repeatedly of patience when no one but himself was impatient. He would often say that when she grew better she must not be allowed to leave the Hall until she was perfectly strong, when no one was even contemplating the remotest chance of her leaving her child, except only himself. Molly once or twice asked her father if she might not speak to the Squire and represent the hardship of sending her away, the improbability that she would consent to quit her boy, and so on; but Mr. Gibson only replied, "Wait quietly. Time enough when nature and circumstance have had their chance and have failed." It was well that Molly was such a favourite with the old servants, for she had frequently to restrain and to control. To be sure, she had her father's authority to back her, and they were aware that where her own comfort, ease, or pleasure was concerned, she never interfered, but submitted to their will. If the Squire had known of the want of attendance to which she submitted with the most perfect meekness, as far as herself was the only sufferer, he would have gone into a towering rage; but Molly hardly thought of it, so anxious was she to do all she could for others, and to remember the various charges which her father gave her in his daily visits. Perhaps he did not spare her enough. She was willing and uncomplaining. But one day, after Mrs. Osborne Hamley had taken the turn, as the nurses called it, when she was lying weak as a new-born baby, but with her faculties all restored, and her fever gone, when spring buds were blooming out, and the spring birds sang merrily, Molly answered to her father's sudden questioning that she felt unaccountably weary, that her head ached heavily, and that she was aware of a sluggishness of thought which it required a painful effort to overcome. "Don't go on," said Mr. Gibson, with a quick pang of anxiety, almost of remorse. "Lie down here with your back to the light. I'll come back and see you before I go." And off he went in search of the Squire. He had a good long walk before he came upon Mr. Hamley in a field of spring wheat, where the women were weeding, his little grandson holding to his finger, in the intervals of short walks of inquiry into the dirtiest places, which was all his sturdy little limbs could manage. "Well, Gibson, and how goes the patient? Better? I wish we could get her out of doors. Such a fine day as it is! It would make her strong as soon as anything. I used to beg my poor lad to come out more. Maybe I worried him, but the air is the finest thing for strengthening that I know of, though perhaps she'll not thrive in English air as if she'd been born here. And she'll not be quite right till she gets back to her native place, wherever that is." "I don't know. I begin to think we shall get her quite round here, and I don't know that she could do it in a better place. But it is not about her. May I order the carriage for my Molly?" Mr. Gibson's voice sounded as if he was choking a little as he said these last words. "To be sure," said the Squire, setting the child down. He had been holding him in his arms the last few minutes, but now he wanted all his eyes to look into Mr. Gibson's face. "I say," said he, catching hold of Mr. Gibson's arm, "what's the matter, man? Don't twitch up your face like that, but speak." "Nothing's the matter," said Mr. Gibson hastily, "only I want her at home under my own eye." And he turned away to go to the house. But the Squire left his field and his weeders, and kept at Mr. Gibson's side. He wanted to speak, but his heart was so full he did not know what to say. "I say, Gibson," he got out at last, "your Molly is liker a child of mine than a stranger, and I reckon we've all of us been coming too hard upon her. You don't think there's much amiss, do you?" "How can I tell?" said Mr. Gibson, almost savagely. But any hastiness of temper was instinctively understood by the Squire, and he was not offended, though he did not speak again till they reached the house. Then he went to order the carriage, and stood by sorrowful enough while the horses were being put in. He felt as if he should not know what to do without Molly. He had never known her value, he thought, till now. But he kept silence on this view of the case, which was a praiseworthy effort on the part of one who usually let bystanders see and hear as much of his passing feelings as if he had had a window in his breast. He stood by while Mr. Gibson helped the faintly smiling, tearful Molly into the carriage. Then the Squire mounted on the step and kissed her hand, but when he tried to thank her and bless her, he broke down, and as soon as he was once more safely on the ground, Mr. Gibson cried out to the coachman to drive on. And so Molly left Hamley Hall. From time to time her father rode up to the window and made some little cheerful and apparently careless remark. When they came within 2 miles of Hollingford, he put spurs to his horse and rode briskly past the carriage windows, kissing his hand to the occupant as he did so. He went on to prepare her home for Molly. When she arrived, Mrs. Gibson was ready to greet her. Mr. Gibson had given 1 or 2 of his bright, imperative orders, and Mrs. Gibson was feeling rather lonely without either of her 2 dear girls at home, as she phrased it to herself as well as to others. "Why, my sweet Molly, this is an unexpected pleasure. Only this morning I said to papa, 'When do you think we shall see our Molly back?' He did not say much, he never does, you know, but I am sure he thought directly of giving me this surprise, this pleasure. You're looking a little, what shall I call it? I remember such a pretty line of poetry. Oh, I call her fair, not pale, so we'll call you Fair. You'd better not call her anything, but let her get to her own room and have a good rest as soon as possible. Haven't you got a trashy novel or 2 in the house? That's the literature to send her to sleep." He did not leave her till he had seen her laid on a sofa in a darkened room, with some slight pretence of reading in her hand. Then he came away, leading his wife, who turned round at the door to kiss her hand to Molly, and make a little face of unwillingness to be dragged away. "Now, Hyacinth," said he, as he took his wife into the drawing room, "she will need much care. She has been overworked, and I've been a fool, that's all. We must keep her from all worry and care, but I won't answer for it that she'll not have an illness for all that. Poor thing! She does look worn out. She is something like me. Her feelings are too much for her. But now she has come home she shall find us as cheerful as possible. I can answer for myself, and you really must brighten up your doleful face, my dear. Nothing's so bad for invalids as the appearance of depression in those around them. I have had such a pleasant letter from Cynthia to day. Uncle Kirkpatrick really seems to make so much of her. He treats her just like a daughter. He has given her a ticket to the concerts of ancient music, and Mr. Henderson has been to call on her, in spite of all that has gone before. For an instant Mr. Gibson thought that it was easy enough for his wife to be cheerful, with the pleasant thoughts and evident anticipations she had in her mind, but a little more difficult for him to put off his doleful looks while his own child lay in a state of suffering and illness which might be the precursor of a still worse malady. But he was always a man for immediate action as soon as he had resolved on the course to be taken, and he knew that some must watch while some must sleep. So runs the wicked world. The illness which he apprehended came upon Molly not violently or acutely, so that there was any immediate danger to be dreaded, but making a long pull upon her strength, which seemed to lessen day by day, until at last her father feared that she might become a permanent invalid. There was nothing very decided or alarming to tell Cynthia, and Mrs. Gibson kept the dark side from her in her letters. Molly was feeling the spring weather, or Molly had been a good deal overdone with her stay at the Hall, and was resting. Such little sentences told nothing of Molly's real state. But then, as Mrs. Gibson said to herself, it would be a pity to disturb Cynthia's pleasure by telling her much about Molly. Indeed, there was not much to tell. One day was so like another. But it so happened that Lady Harriet, who came whenever she could to sit a while with Molly, at first against Mrs. Gibson's will, and afterwards with her full support, for reasons of her own, Lady Harriet wrote a letter to Cynthia, to which she was urged by Mrs. Gibson. It fell out in this manner. One day, when Lady Harriet was sitting in the drawing room for a few minutes after she had been with Molly, she said, "Really, Clare, I spend so much time in your house that I am going to establish a work basket here. Mary has infected me with her notability, and I am going to work mamma a footstool. It is to be a surprise, and so if I do it here she will know nothing about it. Only I cannot match the gold beads I want for the pansies in this dear little town, and Hollingford, who could send me down stars and planets if I asked him, I make no doubt, could no more match beads than—" "My dear Lady Harriet, you forget Cynthia. Think what a pleasure it would be to her to do anything for you." "Would it? Then she shall have plenty of it. But mind, it is you who have answered for her. She shall get me some wool too. How good I am to confer so much pleasure on a fellow creature! But seriously, do you think I might write and give her a few commissions? Neither Agnes nor Mary are in town." "I am sure she would be delighted," said Mrs. Gibson, who also took into consideration the reflection of aristocratic honour that would fall upon Cynthia if she had a letter from a Lady Harriet while at Mr. Kirkpatrick's. So she gave the address, and Lady Harriet wrote. All the first part of the letter was taken up with apology and commissions, but then, never doubting but that Cynthia was aware of Molly's state, she went on to say, "I saw Molly this morning. Twice I have been forbidden admittance, as she was too ill to see any one out of her own family. I wish we could begin to perceive a change for the better, but she looks more fading every time, and I fear Mr. Gibson considers it a very anxious case." The day but one after this letter was dispatched, Cynthia walked into the drawing room at home with as much apparent composure as if she had not left it an hour before. Mrs. Gibson was dozing, but believing herself to be reading, she had been with Molly the greater part of the morning, and now after her lunch, and the invalid's pretence of early dinner, she considered herself entitled to some repose. She started up as Cynthia came in. "Cynthia, dear child, where have you come from? Why in the world have you come? My poor nerves! My heart is quite fluttering. But to be sure it's no wonder with all this anxiety I have to undergo. Why have you come back?" "Because of the anxiety you speak of, mamma. I never knew. You never told me how ill Molly was." "Nonsense! I beg your pardon, my dear, but it's really nonsense. Molly's illness is only nervous, Mr. Gibson says, a nervous fever. But you must remember nerves are mere fancy, and she's getting better. Such a pity for you to have left your uncle's. Who told you about Molly?" "Lady Harriet. She wrote about some wool." "I know. I know, but you must have known she always exaggerates things. Not but what I have been almost worn out with nursing. Perhaps, after all, it is a very good thing you have come, my dear. And now you shall come down into the dining room and have some lunch, and tell me all the Hyde Park Street news, into my room. Don't go into yours yet. Molly is so sensitive to noise." While Cynthia ate her lunch, Mrs. Gibson went on questioning. "And your aunt? How is her cold? And Helen quite strong again? Margaretta as pretty as ever? The boys are at Harrow, I suppose? And my old favourite, Mr. Henderson?" She could not manage to slip in this last inquiry naturally. In spite of herself there was a change of tone, an accent of eagerness. Cynthia did not reply on the instant. She poured herself out some water with great deliberation, and then said, "My aunt is quite well. Helen is as strong as she ever is, and Margaretta very pretty. The boys are at Harrow, and I conclude that Mr. Henderson is enjoying his usual health, for he was to dine at my uncle's to day." "Take care, Cynthia! Look how you are cutting that gooseberry tart!" said Mrs. Gibson, with sharp annoyance, not provoked by Cynthia's present action, although it gave excuse for a little vent of temper. "I can't think how you could come off in this sudden kind of way. I am sure it must have annoyed your uncle and aunt. I daresay they'll never ask you again." "On the contrary, I am to go back there as soon as ever I can be easy to leave Molly." "Easy to leave Molly! Now that really is nonsense, and rather uncomplimentary to me, I must say. Nursing her, as I have been doing, daily and almost nightly, for I have been wakened times out of number by Mr. Gibson getting up, and going to see if she had had her medicine properly." "I'm afraid she has been very ill?" asked Cynthia. "Yes, she has in one way, but not in another. It was what I call more a tedious than an interesting illness. There was no immediate danger, but she lay much in the same state from day to day." "I wish I had known," sighed Cynthia. "Do you think I might go and see her now?" "I'll go and prepare her. You'll find her a good deal better than she has been. Ah, here's Mr. Gibson." He came into the dining room, hearing voices. Cynthia thought that he looked much older. "You here?" said he, coming forward to shake hands. "Why, how did you come?" "By the Umpire. I never knew Molly had been so ill, or I would have come directly." Her eyes were full of tears. Mr. Gibson was touched. He shook her hand again, and murmured, "You're a good girl, Cynthia." "She'd heard one of dear Lady Harriet's exaggerated accounts," said Mrs. Gibson, "and come straight off. I tell her it's very foolish, for really Molly is a great deal better now." "Very foolish," said Mr. Gibson, echoing his wife's words, but smiling at Cynthia. "But sometimes one likes foolish people for their folly better than wise people for their wisdom." "I am afraid folly always annoys me," said his wife. "However, Cynthia is here, and what is done is done." "Very true, my dear. And now I'll run up and see my little girl, and tell her the good news. You'd better follow me in a couple of minutes." This to Cynthia. Molly's delight at seeing her showed itself first in a few happy tears, and then in soft caresses and inarticulate sounds of love. Once or twice she began, "It is such a pleasure," and there she stopped short. But the eloquence of these 5 words sank deep into Cynthia's heart. She had returned just at the right time, when Molly wanted the gentle fillip of the society of a fresh and yet familiar person. Cynthia's tact made her talkative or silent, gay or grave, as the varying humour of Molly required. She listened, too, with the semblance, if not the reality, of unwearied interest, to Molly's continual recurrence to all the time of distress and sorrow at Hamley Hall, and to the scenes which had then so deeply impressed themselves upon her susceptible nature. Cynthia instinctively knew that the repetition of all these painful recollections would ease the oppressed memory, which refused to dwell on anything but what had occurred at a time of feverish disturbance of health. So she never interrupted Molly, as Mrs. Gibson had so frequently done, with, You told me all that before, my dear. Let us talk of something else. Or, really, I cannot allow you to be always dwelling on painful thoughts. Try and be a little more cheerful. Youth is gay. You are young, and therefore you ought to be gay. That is put in a famous form of speech. I forget exactly what it is called." So Molly's health and spirits improved rapidly after Cynthia's return, and although she was likely to retain many of her invalid habits during the summer, she was able to take drives and enjoy the fine weather. It was only her as yet tender spirits that required a little management. All the Hollingford people forgot that they had ever thought of her except as the darling of the town, and each, in his or her way, showed kind interest in her father's child. Miss Browning and Miss Phoebe considered it quite a privilege that they were allowed to see her a fortnight or 3 weeks before any one else. Mrs. Goodenough, spectacles on nose, stirred dainty messes in a silver saucepan for Molly's benefit. The Towers sent books and forced fruit, and new caricatures, and strange and delicate poultry. Humble patients of the doctor, as Mr. Gibson was usually termed, left the earliest cauliflowers they could grow in their cottage gardens with their "duty for Miss." And last of all, though strongest in regard, most piteously eager in interest, came Squire Hamley himself. When she was at the worst, he rode over every day to hear the smallest detail, facing even Mrs. Gibson, his abomination, if her husband was not at home, to ask and hear, till the tears were unconsciously stealing down his cheeks. Every resource of his heart, or his house, or his lands, was searched and tried, if it could not bring a moment's pleasure to her, and whatever it might be that came from him, at her very worst, it brought out a dim smile upon her face. Chapter 54. Chapter 59 of Wives and Daughters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 59. Molly Gibson at Hamley Hall. The conversation ended there for the time. Wedding cake and wine were brought in, and it was Molly's duty to serve them out. But those last words of Mrs. Goodenough's tingled in her ears, and she tried to interpret them to her own satisfaction in any way but the obvious one. And that, too, was destined to be confirmed, for directly after Mrs. Goodenough took her leave, Mrs. Gibson desired Molly to carry away the tray to a table close to an open corner window, where the things might be placed in readiness for any future callers, and underneath this open window went the path from the house door to the road. Molly heard Mrs. Goodenough saying to her granddaughter, "That Mrs. Gibson is a deep 'un. There's Mr. Roger Hamley as like as not to have the Hall estate, and she sends Molly a visiting," and then she passed out of hearing. Molly could have burst out crying, with a full, sudden conviction of what Mrs. Goodenough had been alluding to, her sense of the impropriety of Molly's going to visit at the Hall when Roger was at home. To be sure, Mrs. Goodenough was a commonplace, unrefined woman. Mrs. Gibson did not seem to have even noticed the allusion. Mr. Gibson took it all as a matter of course that Molly should go to the Hall as simply now as she had done before. Roger had spoken of it in so straightforward a manner as showed he had no conception of its being an impropriety. This visit, until now, so happy a subject of anticipation. Molly felt as if she could never speak to any one of the idea to which Mrs. Goodenough's words had given rise, as if she could never be the first to suggest the notion of impropriety which presupposed what she blushed to think of. Then she tried to comfort herself by reasoning. If it had been wrong, forward, or indelicate, really improper in the slightest degree, who would have been so ready as her father to put his veto upon it? But reasoning was of no use after Mrs. Goodenough's words had put fancies into Molly's head. The more she bade these fancies be gone, the more they answered her, as Daniel O'Rourke did the Man in the Moon, when he bade Dan get off his seat on the sickle and go into empty space. The more ye ask us, the more we won't stir. One may smile at a young girl's miseries of this description, but they are very real and stinging miseries to her. All that Molly could do was to resolve on a single eye to the dear old Squire and his mental and bodily comforts, to try and heal up any breaches which might have occurred between him and AimÄe, and to ignore Roger as much as possible. Good Roger, kind Roger, dear Roger! It would be very hard to avoid him as much as was consistent with the common politeness, but it would be right to do it. And when she was with him she must be as natural as possible, or he might observe some difference. But what was natural? How much ought she avoid being with him? Would he ever notice if she was more chary of her company, more calculating of her words? Alas! The simplicity of their intercourse was spoilt henceforwards. She made laws for herself. She resolved to devote herself to the Squire and to AimÄe, and to forget Mrs. Goodenough's foolish speeches. But her perfect freedom was gone, and with it half her chance. That is to say, half her chance would have been lost over any strangers who had not known her before. They would probably have thought her stiff and awkward, and apt to say things and then retract them. But she was so different from her usual self that Roger noticed the change in her as soon as she arrived at the Hall. She had carefully measured out the days of her visit. They were to be exactly the same number as she had spent at the Towers. She feared lest if she stayed at the Hall a shorter time the Squire might be annoyed. Yet how charming the place looked in its early autumnal glow as she drove up! And there was Roger at the hall door waiting to receive her, watching for her coming. And now he retreated, apparently to summon his sister-in-law, who came now timidly forward in her deep widow's mourning, holding her boy in her arms as if to protect her shyness. But he struggled down and ran towards the carriage, eager to greet his friend the coachman, and to obtain a promised ride. Roger did not say much himself. He wanted to make AimÄe feel her place as daughter of the house, but she was too timid to speak much, and she only took Molly by the hand and led her into the drawing-room, where, as if by a sudden impulse of gratitude for all the tender nursing she had received during her illness, she put her arms round Molly and kissed her long and well, and after that they came to be friends. It was nearly lunch-time, and the Squire always made his appearance at that meal, more for the pleasure of seeing his grandson eat his dinner than for any hunger of his own. To-day Molly quickly saw the whole state of the family affairs. She thought that even had Roger said nothing about them at the Towers, she should have found out that neither the father nor the daughter-in-law had as yet found the clue to each other's characters, although they had now been living for several months in the same house. AimÄe seemed to forget her English in her nervousness, and to watch with the jealous eyes of a dissatisfied mother all the proceedings of the Squire towards her little boy. They were not of the wisest kind, it must be owned. The child sipped the strong ale with evident relish, and clamoured for everything which he saw the others enjoying. AimÄe could hardly attend to Molly for her anxiety as to what her boy was doing and eating, yet she said nothing. Roger took the end of the table opposite to that at which sat grandfather and grandchild. After the boy's first wants were gratified, the Squire addressed himself to Molly. "Well, and so you can come here a-visiting, though you have been among the grand folks. I thought you were going to cut us, Miss Molly, when I heard you was gone to the Towers. Could not find any other place to stay at while your father and mother were away, but an earl's, eh?" "They asked me, and I went," said Molly. "Now you've asked me, and I've come here." "I think you might 'a' known you'd always have been welcome here, without waiting for asking." Why, Molly, I look upon you as a kind of a daughter more than madame there," dropping his voice a little, and perhaps supposing that the child's babble would drown the signification of his words. "Nay, you need not look at me so pitifully. She does not follow English readily." "I think she does," said Molly in a low voice, not looking up, however, for fear of catching another glimpse of AimÄe's sudden forlornness of expression and deepened color. She felt grateful, as if for a personal favor, when she heard Roger speaking to AimÄe the moment afterwards in the tender tones of brotherly friendliness, and presently these two were sufficiently engaged in a tête à tête conversation to allow Molly and the Squire to go on talking. "He's a sturdy chap, is he not?" said the Squire, stroking the little Roger's curly head. "And he can puff 4 puffs at grandpapa's pipe without being sick, can't he?" "I s'n't puff any more puffs," said the boy resolutely. "Mamma says no, I s'n't." "That's just like her," said the Squire, dropping his voice this time, however. "As if it could do the child any harm!" Molly made a point of turning the conversation from all personal subjects after this, and kept the Squire talking about the progress of his drainage during the rest of lunch. He offered to take her to see it, and she acceded to the proposal, thinking, meantime, how little she need have anticipated the being thrown too intimately with Roger, who seemed to devote himself to his sister-in-law. But in the evening, when AimÄe had gone upstairs to put her boy to bed, and the Squire was asleep in his easy-chair, a sudden flush of memory brought Mrs. Goodenough's words again to her mind. She was virtually tête à tête with Roger, as she had been dozens of times before, but now she could not help assuming an air of constraint. Her eyes did not meet his in the old frank way. She took up a book at a pause in the conversation, and left him puzzled and annoyed at the change in her manner. And so it went on during all the time of her visit. If sometimes she forgot and let herself go into all her old naturalness, by and by she checked herself, and became comparatively cold and reserved. Roger was pained at all this, more pained day after day, more anxious to discover the cause. AimÄe, too, silently noticed how different Molly became in Roger's presence. One day she could not help saying to Molly, "Don't you like Roger? You would if you only knew how good he was. He is learned, but that is nothing. It is his goodness that one admires and loves." "He is very good," said Molly. "I have known him long enough to know that." "But you don't think him agreeable?" "He is not like my poor husband, to be sure, and you knew him well, too." "Ah, tell me about him once again, when you first knew him, when his mother was alive." Molly had grown very fond of AimÄe. When the latter was at her ease, she had very charming and attaching ways; but feeling uneasy in her position in the Squire's house, she was almost repellent to him, and he, too, put on his worst side to her. Roger was most anxious to bring them together, and had several consultations with Molly as to the best means of accomplishing this end. As long as they talked upon this subject, she spoke to him in the quiet, sensible manner which she inherited from her father; but when their discussions on this point were ended, she fell back into her piquant assumption of dignified reserve. It was very difficult to her to maintain this strange manner, especially when once or twice she fancied that it gave him pain, and she would go into her own room and suddenly burst into tears on these occasions, and wish that her visit was ended, and that she was once again in the eventless tranquillity of her own home. Yet presently her fancy changed, and she clung to the swiftly passing hours, as if she would still retain the happiness of each. For, unknown to her, Roger was exerting himself to make her visit pleasant. He was not willing to appear as the instigator of all the little plans for each day, for he felt as if somehow he did not hold the same place in her regard as formerly. Still, one day AimÄe suggested a nutting expedition. Another day they gave little Roger the unheard-of pleasure of tea out of doors. There was something else agreeable for a third, and it was Roger who arranged all these simple pleasures, such as he knew Molly would enjoy. But to her he only appeared as the ready forwarder of Aimée's devices. The week was nearly gone, when one morning the Squire found Roger sitting in the old library with a book before him, it is true, but so deep in thought that he was evidently startled by his father's unexpected entrance. "I thought I should find thee here, my lad. We'll have the old room done up again before winter. It smells musty enough, and yet I see it's the place for thee. I want thee to go with me round the 5 acre. I'm thinking of laying it down in grass. It's time for you to be getting into the fresh air. You look quite woebegone over books, books, books. There never was a thing like 'em for stealing a man's health out of him." So Roger went out with his father, without saying many words till they were at some distance from the house. Then he brought out a sentence with such an abruptness that he repaid his father for the start the latter had given him a quarter of an hour before. "Father, you remember I'm going out again to the Cape next month. You spoke of doing up the library. If it is for me, I shall be away all the winter." "Can't you get off it?" pleaded his father. "I thought maybe you'd forgotten all about it." "Not likely," said Roger, half smiling. "Well, but they might have found another man to finish up your work." "No one can finish it but myself. Besides, an engagement is an engagement. When I wrote to Lord Hollingford to tell him I must come home, I promised to go out again for another 6 months." "Ay, I know, and perhaps it will put it out of thy mind. It will always be hard on me to part from thee, but I dare say it's best for you." Roger's colour deepened. "You are alluding to Miss Kirkpatrick? Mrs. Henderson, I mean. Father, let me tell you once for all, I think that was rather a hasty affair. I am pretty sure now that we were not suited to each other. I was wretched when I got her letter at the Cape, I mean, but I believe it was for the best." "That's right. That's my own boy," said the Squire, turning round and shaking hands with his son with vehemence. "And now I'll tell you what I heard the other day, when I was at the magistrates' meeting. They were all saying she had jilted Preston. I don't want to hear anything against her. She may have her faults, but I can never forget how I once loved her." "Well, well, perhaps it's right. I was not so bad about it, was I, Roger? Poor Osborne need not have been so secret with me. I asked your Miss Cynthia out here, and her mother and all. My bark is worse than my bite; for if I had a wish on earth, it was to see Osborne married as befitted one of an old stock; and he went and chose out this French girl, of no family at all, only a never mind what she was, look at what she is. I wonder you are not more taken with her humility and sweetness, father." "I don't even call her pretty," said the Squire, uneasily, for he dreaded a repetition of the arguments which Roger had often used to make him give Aimée her proper due of affection and position. "Now your Miss Cynthia was pretty, I will say that for her, the baggage! And to think that when you two lads flew right in your father's face and picked out girls below you in rank and family, and you should neither of you have set your fancies on my little Molly there. I daresay I should ha' been angry enough at the time, but the lassie would ha' found her way to my heart, as never this French lady, nor t'other one, could ha' done." Roger did not answer. "I don't see why you might not put up for her still. I'm humble enough now, and you're not heir as Osborne was, who married a servant maid. Don't you think you could turn your thoughts upon Molly Gibson, Roger?" "No," said Roger shortly. "It's too late, too late. Don't let us talk any more of my marrying. Is not this the 5 acre field?" And soon he was discussing the relative values of meadow, arable, and pasture land with his father, as heartily as if he had never known Molly or loved Cynthia. But the Squire was not in such good spirits, and went but heavily into the discussion. At the end of it he said, apropos des bottes, "But don't you think you could like her if you tried, Roger?" Roger knew perfectly well to what his father was alluding, but for an instant he was on the point of pretending to misunderstand. At length, however, he said in a low voice, "I shall never try, father. Don't let us talk any more about it. As I said before, it is too late." The Squire was like a child to whom some toy had been refused. From time to time the thought of his disappointment in this matter recurred to his mind, and then he took to blaming Cynthia as the primary cause of Roger's present indifferences to womankind. It so happened that on Molly's last morning at the Hall she received her first letter from Cynthia, Mrs. Henderson. It was just before breakfast time. Roger was out of doors. Aimée had not as yet come down. Molly was alone in the dining room, where the table was already laid. She had just finished reading her letter when the Squire came in, and she immediately and joyfully told him what the morning had brought to her. But when she saw the Squire's face she could have bitten her tongue out for having named Cynthia's name to him. He looked vexed and depressed. "I wish I might never hear of her again, I do. She's been the bane of my Roger, that's what she has. I have not slept half the night, and it's all her fault. Why, there's my boy saying now that he has no heart for ever marrying, poor lad. I wish it had been you, Molly, my lads had taken a fancy for. I told Roger so t'other day, and I said that, for all you were beneath what I ever thought to see them marry. Well, it's of no use. It's too late now, as he said. Only never let me hear that baggage's name again, that's all. And no offence to you either, lassie. I know you love the wench, but if you'll take an old man's word, you're worth a score of her. I wish young men would think so too," he muttered as he went to the side table to carve the ham, while Molly poured out the tea, her heart very hot all the time, and effectually silenced for a space. It was with the greatest difficulty that she could keep tears of mortification from falling. She felt altogether in a wrong position in that house, which had been like a home to her until this last visit. What with Mrs. Goodenough's remarks, and now this speech of the Squire's, implying, at least to her susceptible imagination, that his father had proposed her as a wife to Roger, and that she had been rejected, she was more glad than she could express or even think that she was going home this very morning. Roger came in from his walk while she was in this state of feeling. He saw in an instant that something had distressed Molly, and he longed to have the old friendly right of asking her what it was. But she had effectually kept him at too great a distance during the last few days for him to feel at liberty to speak to her in the old straightforward brotherly way, especially now when he perceived her efforts to conceal her feelings, and the way in which she drank her tea in feverish haste, and accepted bread only to crumble it about her plate untouched. It was all that he could do to make talk under these circumstances, but he backed up her efforts as well as he could until Aimée came down, grave and anxious. Her boy had not had a good night, and did not seem well. He had fallen into a feverish sleep now, or she could not have left him. Immediately the whole table was in a ferment. The Squire pushed away his plate, and could eat no more. Roger was trying to extract a detail or a fact out of Aimée, who began to give way to tears. Molly quickly proposed that the carriage, which had been ordered to take her home at 11, should come round immediately. She had everything ready, packed up, she said, and bring back her father at once. By leaving directly, she said it was probable they might catch him after he had returned from his morning visits in the town, and before he had set off on his more distant round. Her proposal was agreed to, and she went upstairs to put on her things. She came down all ready into the drawing-room, expecting to find Aimée and the Squire there. But during her absence word had been brought to the anxious mother and grandfather that the child had wakened up in a panic, and both had rushed up to their darling. But Roger was in the drawing-room awaiting Molly, with a large bunch of the choicest flowers. "Look, Molly," said he, as she was on the point of leaving the room again, on finding him there alone. I gathered these flowers for you before breakfast." He came to meet her reluctant advance. "Thank you," said she. "You are very kind. I am very much obliged to you." "Then you must do something for me," said he, determined not to notice the restraint of her manner, and making the rearrangement of the flowers which she held a sort of link between them, so that she could not follow her impulse and leave the room. "Tell me, honestly, as I know you will if you speak at all, have not I done something to vex you since we were so happy at the Towers together?" His voice was so kind and true, his manner so winning yet wistful, that Molly would have been thankful to tell him all. She believed that he could have helped her more than any one to understand how she ought to behave rightly. He would have disentangled her fancies, if only he himself had not lain at the very core and centre of all her perplexity and dismay. How could she tell him of Mrs. Goodenough's words troubling her maiden modesty? How could she ever repeat what her father had said that morning, and assure him that she, no more than he, wished that their old friendliness should be troubled by the thought of a nearer relationship? "No, you never vexed me in my whole life, Roger," said she, looking straight at him for the first time for many days. "I believe you because you say so. I have no right to ask further. Molly, will you give me back one of those flowers as a pledge of what you have said?" "Take whichever you like," said she, eagerly offering him the whole nosegay to choose from. "No, you must choose, and you must give it me." Just then the Squire came in. Roger would have been glad if Molly had not gone on so eagerly to ransack the bunch for the choicest flower in his father's presence, but she exclaimed, "Oh, please, Mr. Hamley, do you know which is Roger's favourite flower?" "No. A rose, I dare say. The carriage is at the door, and Molly, my dear, I don't want to hurry you, but I know. Here, Roger, here is a rose." And red as a rose was she. "I will find papa as soon as ever I get home. How is the little boy?" "I'm afraid he's beginning of some kind of a fever." And the Squire took her to the carriage, talking all the way of the little boy, Roger following, and hardly heeding what he was doing in the answer to the question he kept asking himself, "Too late or not? Can she ever forget that my first foolish love was given to one so different?" While she, as the carriage rolled away, kept saying to herself, "We are friends again. I don't believe he will remember what the dear Squire took it into his head to suggest for many days. It is so pleasant to be on the old terms again. And what lovely flowers!" End of Chapter 59.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Mather. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 40. Molly Gibson Breathes Freely. That was the way in which Mrs. Gibson first broached her intention of accompanying Cynthia up to London for a few days' visit. She had a trick of producing the first sketch of any new plan before an outsider to the family circle, so that the first emotions of others, if they disapproved of her projects, had to be repressed until the idea had become familiar to them. To Molly it seemed too charming a proposal ever to come to pass. She had never allowed herself to recognize the restraint she was under in her stepmother's presence, but all at once she found it out when her heart danced at the idea of 3 whole days, for that it would be at the least, of perfect freedom of intercourse with her father, of old times come back again, of meals without perpetual fidgetiness after details of ceremony and correctness of attendance. "We'll have bread and cheese for dinner, and eat it on our knees. We'll make up for having had to eat sloppy puddings with a fork instead of a spoon all this time, by putting our knives in our mouths till we cut ourselves. Papa shall pour his tea into his saucer if he's in a hurry, and if I'm thirsty, I'll take the slop basin. And oh, if I could but get by, borrow or steal any kind of an old horse! My grey skirt is not new, but it will do. That would be too delightful. After all, I think I can be happy again. For months and months it has seemed as if I had got too old ever to feel pleasure, much less happiness again. So thought Molly. Yet she blushed as if with guilt when Cynthia, reading her thoughts, said to her one day, "Molly, you are very glad to get rid of us, are you not?" "Not of you, Cynthia, at least I don't think I am. Only if you only knew how I love papa, and how I used to see a great deal more of him than I ever do now. Ah, I often think what interlopers we must seem, and are in fact. I don't feel you as such. You, at any rate, have been a new delight to me, a sister, and I never knew how charming such a relationship could be." "But mamma?" said Cynthia, half suspiciously, half sorrowfully. "She is papa's wife," said Molly quietly. "I don't mean to say I am not often very sorry to feel I am no longer first with him, but it was—" The violent colour flushed into her face till even her eyes burnt, and she suddenly found herself on the point of crying. The weeping ash tree, the misery, the slow dropping comfort, and the comforters came all so vividly before her. "It was Roger," she went on, looking up at Cynthia as she overcame her slight hesitation at mentioning his name, "Roger, who told me how I ought to take papa's marriage, when I was first startled and grieved at the news. Oh, Cynthia, what a great thing it is to be loved by him!" Cynthia blushed, and looked fluttered and pleased. "Well, yes, I suppose it is. At the same time, Molly, I'm afraid he'll expect me to be always as good as he fancies me now, and I shall have to walk on tiptoe all the rest of my life." "But you are good, Cynthia," put in Molly. "No, I'm not. You're just as much mistaken as he is. And some day I shall go down in your opinions with a run, just like the hall clock the other day when the spring broke." "I think he'll love you just as much," said Molly. "Would you be my friend if it turned out ever that I had done very wrong things? Would you remember how very difficult it has sometimes been to me to act rightly?" She took hold of Molly's hand as she spoke. "We won't speak of mamma, for your sake as much as mine or hers. But you must see she is not one to help a girl with much good advice, or good... Oh, Molly, you don't know how I was neglected just at a time when I wanted friends most. Mamma does not know it. It is not in her to know what I might have been if I had only fallen into wise, good hands, but I know it. And what's more," continued she, suddenly ashamed of her unusual exhibition of feeling, "I try not to care, which I daresay is really the worst of all. But I could worry myself to death if I once took to serious thinking." "I wish I could help you, or even understand you," said Molly, after a moment or two of sad perplexity. "You can help me," said Cynthia, changing her manner abruptly. "I can trim bonnets and make headdresses, but somehow my hands can't fold up gowns and collars like your deft little fingers. Please, will you help me to pack? That's a real tangible piece of kindness, and not sentimental consolation for sentimental distresses, which are perhaps imaginary after all." In general, it is the people who are left behind stationary who give way to low spirits at any parting. The travellers, however bitterly they may feel the separation, find something in the change of scene to soften regret in the very first hour of separation. But as Molly walked home with her father from seeing Mrs. Gibson and Cynthia off to London by the Umpire coach, she almost danced along the street. "Now, papa," said she, "I'm going to have you all to myself for a whole week. You must be very obedient." "Don't be tyrannical, then. You are walking me out of breath, and we are cutting Mrs. Goodenough in our hurry." So they crossed over the street to speak to Mrs. Goodenough. "We've just been seeing my wife and her daughter off to London. Mrs. Gibson has gone up for a week." "Deary, deary, to London, and only for a week? Why, I can remember its being a 3 days' journey. It will be very lonesome for you, Miss Molly, without your young companion." "Yes," said Molly, suddenly feeling as if she ought to have taken this view of the case. "I shall miss Cynthia very much." And you, Mr. Gibson, why, it will be like being a widower all over again. You must come and drink tea with me some evening. We must try and cheer you up a bit among us. Shall it be Tuesday?" In spite of the sharp pinch which Molly gave to his arm, Mr. Gibson accepted the invitation, much to the gratification of the old lady. "Papa, how could you go and waste one of our evenings? We have but 6 in all, and now but 5, and I had so reckoned on our doing all sorts of things together." "What sort of things?" "Oh, I don't know. Everything that is unrefined and ungenteel," added she, slyly looking up into her father's face. His eyes twinkled, but the rest of his face was perfectly grave. "I'm not going to be corrupted. With toil and labour I have reached a very fair height of refinement. I won't be pulled down again." "Yes, you will, papa. We'll have bread and cheese for lunch this very day, and you shall wear your slippers in the drawing-room every evening. You'll stay quietly at home. And oh, papa, don't you think I could ride Nora Creina? I've been looking out the old grey skirt, and I think I could make myself tidy." "Where's the side saddle to come from?" "To be sure, the old one won't fit the great Irish mare, but I'm not particular, papa. I think I could manage somehow." "Thank you, but I'm not quite going to return into barbarism. It may be a depraved taste, but I should like to see my daughter properly mounted." "Think of riding together down the lanes! Why, the dog roses must be all out in flower, and the honeysuckles, and the hay. How I should like to see Merriman's farm again! Papa, do let me have one ride with you, please do. I'm sure we can manage it somehow." And somehow it was managed. Somehow all Molly's wishes came to pass. There was only one little drawback to this week of holiday and happy intercourse with her father. Everybody would ask them out to tea. They were quite like a bride and bridegroom, for the fact was that the late dinners which Mrs. Gibson had introduced into her own house were a great inconvenience in the calculations of the small tea drinkings at Hollingford. How ask people to tea at 6 who dined at that hour? How, when they refused cake and sandwiches at 8:30? How induce other people who were really hungry to commit a vulgarity before these calm and scornful eyes? So there had been a great lull of invitations for the Gibsons to Hollingford tea parties. Mrs. Gibson, whose object was to squeeze herself into county society, had taken this being left out of the smaller festivities with great equanimity, but Molly missed the kind homeliness of the parties to which she had gone from time to time as long as she could remember. And though, as each 3-cornered note was brought in, she grumbled a little over the loss of another charming tête-à-tête with her father, she really was glad to go again in the old way among old friends. Miss Browning and Miss Phoebe were especially compassionate towards her in her loneliness. If they had had their will, she would have dined there every day, and she had to call upon them very frequently in order to prevent their being hurt at her declining the dinners. Mrs. Gibson wrote twice during her week's absence to her husband. That piece of news was quite satisfactory to the Miss Brownings, who had of late months held themselves a great deal aloof from a house where they chose to suppose that their presence was not wanted. In their winter evenings they had often talked over Mr. Gibson's household, and having little besides conjectures to go upon, they found the subject interminable, as they could vary the possibilities every day. One of their wonders was how Mr. and Mrs. Gibson really got on together. Another was whether Mrs. Gibson was extravagant or not. Now 2 letters during the week of her absence showed what was in those days considered a very proper amount of conjugal affection, yet not too much, at 11 halfpenny postage. A 3rd letter would have been extravagant. Sister looked to sister with an approving nod as Molly named the 2nd letter, which arrived in Hollingford the very day before Mrs. Gibson was to return. They had settled between themselves that 2 letters would show the right amount of good feeling and proper understanding in the Gibson family. More would have been extravagant, only 1 would have been a mere matter of duty. There had been rather a question between Miss Browning and Miss Phoebe as to which person the 2nd letter, supposing it came, was to be addressed. It would be very conjugal to write twice to Mr. Gibson, and yet it would be very pretty if Molly came in for her share. "You've had another letter, you say, my dear?" asked Miss Browning. "I dare say Mrs. Gibson has written to you this time?" "It is a large sheet, and Cynthia has written on one half to me, and all the rest is to papa." "A very nice arrangement, I'm sure. And what does Cynthia say? Is she enjoying herself?" "Oh yes, I think so. They have had a dinner party, and one night when mamma was at Lady Cumnor's, Cynthia went to the play with her cousins." "Upon my word! And all in 1 week? I do call that dissipation. Why, Thursday would be taken up with the journey, and Friday with resting, and Sunday is Sunday all the world over, and they must have written on Tuesday. Well, I hope Cynthia won't find Hollingford dull, that's all, when she comes back." "I don't think it's likely," said Miss Phoebe, with a little simper and a knowing look, which sat oddly on her kindly innocent face. "You see a great deal of Mr. Preston, don't you, Molly?" "Mr. Preston?" said Molly, flushing up with surprise. "No, not much. He's been at Ashcombe all winter, you know. He has but just come back to settle here. What should make you think so?" "Oh, a little bird told us," said Miss Browning. Molly knew that little bird from her childhood, and had always hated it and longed to wring its neck. Why could not people speak out and say that they did not mean to give up the name of their informant? But it was a very favourite form of fiction with the Miss Brownings, and to Miss Phoebe it was the very acme of wit. "The little bird was flying around one day in Heath Lane, and it saw Mr. Preston and a young lady, we won't say who, walking together in a very friendly manner. That is to say, he was on horseback, but the path is raised above the road, just where there is a little wooden bridge over the brook." "Perhaps Molly is in the secret, and we ought not to ask her about it," said Miss Phoebe, seeing Molly's extreme discomfiture and annoyance. "It can be no great secret," said Miss Browning, dropping the little bird formula, and assuming an air of dignified reproval at Miss Phoebe's interruption. "It can be no great secret, for Miss Hornblower says Mr. Preston owns to become engaged." "At any rate, it is not to Cynthia, that I know positively," said Molly, with some vehemence. "And pray put a stop to any such reports. You don't know what mischief they may do. I do so hate that kind of chatter." It was not very respectful of Molly to speak in this way, to be sure, but she thought only of Roger, and the distress any such reports might cause should he ever hear of them in the centre of Africa, made her colour up scarlet with vexation. "Highty-tighty, Miss Molly, don't you remember that I am old enough to be your mother, and that it is not pretty behaviour to speak so to us, to me? Chatter, to be sure. Really, Molly—" "I beg your pardon," said Molly, only half penitent. "I daresay you did not mean to speak so to sister," said Miss Phoebe, trying to make peace. Molly did not answer all at once. She wanted to explain how much mischief might be done by such reports. "But don't you see," she went on, still flushed by vexation, "how bad it is to talk of such things in such a way? Supposing one of them cared for some one else, and that might happen, you know. Mr. Preston, for instance, may be engaged to some one else." "Molly, I pity the woman, indeed I do. I have a very poor opinion of Mr. Preston," said Miss Browning, in a warning tone of voice, for a new idea had come into her head. "Well, but the woman or young lady would not like to hear such reports about Mr. Preston." "Perhaps not. But for all that, take my word for it, he's a great flirt, and young ladies had better not have much to do with him." "I daresay it was all accident, their meeting in Heath Lane," said Miss Phoebe. "I know nothing about it," said Molly, "and I daresay I have been impertinent. Only please don't talk about it any more. I have my reasons for asking you." She got up, for by the striking of the church clock she had just found out that it was later than she had thought, and she knew that her father would be at home by this time. She bent down and kissed Miss Browning's grave and passive face. "How you are growing, Molly!" said Miss Phoebe, anxious to cover over her sister's displeasure. "As tall and as straight as a poplar tree, as the old song says." "Grow in grace, Molly, as well as in good looks," said Miss Browning, watching her out of the room. As soon as she was fairly gone, Miss Browning got up and shut the door quite securely, and then, sitting down near her sister, she said in a low voice, "Phoebe, it was Molly herself that was with Mr. Preston in Heath Lane that day when Mrs. Goodenough saw them together." "Gracious goodness me!" exclaimed Miss Phoebe, receiving it at once as gospel. "How do you know?" "By putting two and two together. Did you not notice how red Molly went, and then pale, and how she said she knew for a fact that Mr. Preston and Cynthia Kirkpatrick were not engaged?" "Well, perhaps not engaged, but Mrs. Goodenough saw them loitering together all by their own two selves." "Mrs. Goodenough only crossed Heath Lane at the Shire Oak, as she was riding in her phaeton," said Miss Browning sententiously. "We all know what a coward she is in a carriage, so that most likely she had only half her wits about her, and her eyes are none of the best when she is standing steady on the ground. Molly and Cynthia have got those new plaid shawls just alike, and they trim their bonnets alike, and Molly is grown as tall as Cynthia since Christmas. I was always afraid she'd be short and stumpy, but she's now as tall and slender as any one need be. I'll answer for it, Mrs. Goodenough saw Molly and took her for Cynthia." When Miss Browning answered for it, Miss Phoebe gave up doubting. She sat some time in silence, revolving her thoughts. Then she said, "It would not be such a very bad match after all, sister." She spoke very meekly, awaiting her sister's sanction to her opinion. "Phoebe, it would be a bad match for Mary Preston's daughter. If I had known what I know now, we'd never have had him to tea last September." "Why, what do you know?" asked Miss Phoebe. "Miss Hornblower told me many things, some that I don't think you ought to hear, Phoebe. He was engaged to a very pretty Miss Gregson, at Henwick, where he comes from, and her father made inquiries and heard so much that was bad about him that he made his daughter break off the match, and she's dead since." "How shocking!" said Miss Phoebe, duly impressed. "Besides, he plays at billiards, and he bets at races, and some people do say he keeps race horses." "But is not it strange that the Earl keeps him on as his agent?" "No, perhaps not. He's very clever about land, and very sharp in all law affairs, and my lord is not bound to take notice, if indeed he knows, of the manner in which Mr. Preston talks when he has taken too much wine." "Taken too much wine! Oh, sister, is he a drunkard? And we have had him to tea." "I did not say a drunkard, Phoebe," said Miss Browning pettishly. "A man may take too much wine occasionally without being a drunkard. Don't let me hear you using such coarse words, Phoebe." Miss Phoebe was silent for a time after this rebuke. Presently she said, "I do hope it was not Molly Gibson." "You may hope as much as you like, but I'm pretty sure it was. However, we'd better say nothing about it to Mrs. Goodenough. She has got Cynthia into her head, and there let her rest. Time enough to set reports afloat about Molly when we know there's some truth in them. Mr. Preston might do for Cynthia, who's been brought up France, though she has such pretty manners. But it may have made her not particular. He must not, and he shall not, have Molly, if I go into church and forbid the banns myself. But I'm afraid there's something between her and him. We must keep on the lookout, Phoebe. I'll be her guardian angel in spite of herself." End of chapter 40.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 49. Molly Gibson Finds a Champion. Lady Cumnor had so far recovered from the violence of her attack and from the consequent operation as to be able to be removed to the Towers for a change of air, and accordingly she was brought thither by her whole family with all the pomp and state becoming an invalid peeress. There was every probability that the family would make a longer residence at the Towers than they had done for several years, during which time they had been wanderers hither and thither in search of health. However, after all, it was very pleasant and restful to come to the old ancestral home, and every member of the family enjoyed it in his or her own way. Lord Cumnor most especially. His talent for gossip and his love of small details had scarcely fair play in the hurry of a London life, and were much nipped in the bud during his continental sojournings, as he neither spoke French fluently nor understood it easily when spoken. Besides, he was a great proprietor, and liked to know how his land was going on, how his tenants were faring in the world. He liked to hear of their births, marriages, and deaths, and had something of a royal memory for faces. In short, if ever a peer was an old woman, Lord Cumnor was that peer. But he was a very good-natured old woman, and rode about on his stout old cob, with his pockets full of halfpence for the children, and little packets of snuff for the old people. Like an old woman, too, he enjoyed an afternoon cup of tea in his wife's sitting-room, and over his gossip's beverage he would repeat all that he had learnt in the day. Lady Cumnor was exactly in that state of convalescence when such talk as her lord's was extremely agreeable to her, but she had contemned the habit of listening to gossip so severely all her life that she thought it due to consistency to listen first and enter a supercilious protest afterward. It had, however, come to be a family habit for all of them to gather together in Lady Cumnor's room on their return for their daily walks or drives or rides, and over the fire, sipping their tea at her early meal, to recount the morsels of local intelligence they had heard during the morning. When they had said all that they had to say, and not before, they always had to listen to a short homily from her ladyship on the well-worn texts, the poorness of conversation about persons, the probable falsehood of all they had heard, and the degradation of character implied by its repetition. On one of these November evenings they were all assembled in Lady Cumnor's room. She was lying, all draped in white and covered up with an Indian shawl, on a sofa near the fire. Lady Harriet sate on the rug, close before the wood fire, picking up fallen embers with a pair of dwarf tongs, and piling them on the red and odorous heap in the centre of the hearth. Lady Cuxhaven, notable from girlhood, was using the blind man's holiday to net fruit nets for the walls at Cuxhaven Park. Lady Cumnor's woman was trying to see to pour out tea by the light of one small wax candle in the background, for Lady Cumnor could not bear much light to her weakened eyes, and the great leafless branches of the trees outside the house kept sweeping against the windows, moved by the wind that was gathering. It was always Lady Cumnor's habit to snub those she loved best. Her husband was perpetually snubbed by her, yet she missed him now that he was later than usual, and professed not to want her tea, but they all knew that it was only because he was not there to hand it to her, and be found fault with for his invariable stupidity in forgetting that she liked to put sugar in before she took any cream. At length he burst in. "I beg your pardon, my lady, I'm later than I should have been, I know. Why, haven't you had your tea yet?" he exclaimed, bustling about to get the cup for his wife. "You know I never take cream before I've sweetened it," said she, with even more emphasis on the never than usual. "To be sure, what a simpleton I am! I think I might have remembered it by this time. You see, I met old Sheepshanks, and that's the reason of it." "Of your handing me the cream before the sugar?" asked his wife. It was one of her grim jokes. "No, no, ha, ha! You're better this evening, I think, my dear. But as I was saying, Sheepshanks is such an eternal talker, there's no getting away from him, and I had no idea it was so late." "Well, I think the least you can do is tell us something of Mr. Sheepshanks' conversation, now that you have torn yourself away from him." "Conversation? Did I call it conversation? I don't think I said much. I listened. He really has always a great deal to say, more than Preston, for instance. And, by the way, he was telling me something about Preston. Old Sheepshanks thinks he'll be getting married before long. He says there's a great deal of gossip going on about him and Gibson's daughter. They've been caught meeting in the park and corresponding, and all that kind of thing is likely to end in a marriage." "I shall be very sorry," said Lady Harriet. "I always liked that girl, and I can't bear papa's model land agent." "I dare say it's not true," said Lady Cumnor, in a very audible aside to Lady Harriet. "Papa picks up stories one day to contradict them the next." Ah, but this did sound like truth. Sheepshanks said all the old ladies in the town had got hold of it, and were making a great scandal out of it. "I don't think it sounds quite a nice story. I wonder what Clare could be doing to allow such goings on," said Lady Cuxhaven. I think it is much more likely that Clare's own daughter, that pretty, pocky Miss Kirkpatrick, is the real heroine of this story," said Lady Harriet. "She always looks like a heroine of genteel comedy, and those young ladies were capable of a good deal of innocent intriguing, if I remember rightly. Now, little Miss Molly Gibson has a certain gaucherie about her which would disqualify her at once from any clandestine proceedings. Besides, clandestine, why, the child is truth itself. Papa, are you sure Mr. Sheepshanks said it was Miss Gibson that was exciting Hollingford scandal? Wasn't it Miss Kirkpatrick? The notion of her and Mr. Preston making a match of it does not sound so incongruous. But if it's my little friend Molly, I'll go to church and forbid the banns. Really, Harriet, I can't think what always makes you take such an interest in all these petty Hollingford affairs." "Mamma, it's only tit for tat. They take the most lively interest in all our sayings and doings. If I were going to be married, they would want to know every possible particular. Where we first met, what we first said to each other, what I wore, and whether he offered by letter or in person. I'm sure those good Miss Brownings were wonderfully well informed as to Mary's methods of managing her nursery and educating her girls, so it's only a proper return of the compliment to want to know on our side how they are going on. I am quite of papa's faction. I like to hear all the local gossip." "Especially when it is flavoured with a spice of scandal and impropriety, as in this case," said Lady Cumnor, with the momentary bitterness of a convalescent invalid. Lady Harriet coloured with annoyance, but then she rallied her courage and said with more gravity than before, "I am really interested in this story about Molly Gibson, I own. I both like and respect her, and I do not like to hear her name coupled with that of Mr. Preston. I can't help fancying papa has made some mistake." "No, my dear, I'm sure I'm repeating what I heard. I'm sorry I said anything about it if it annoys you or my lady there. Sheepshanks did say Miss Gibson, though, and he went on to say it was a pity the girl had got herself so talked about, for it was the way they had carried on that gave rise to all the chatter. Preston himself was a very fair match for her, and nobody could have objected to it. But I'll try and find a more agreeable piece of news. Old Margery at the lodge is dead, and they don't know where to find some one to teach clear starching at your school, and Robert Hall made £40 last year by his apples." So they drifted away from Molly and her affairs, only Lady Harriet kept turning what she heard over in her mind with interest and wonder. "I warned her against him on the day of her father's wedding, and what a straightforward, outspoken lassie it was then! I don't believe it. It's only one of old Sheepshanks' stories, half invention and half deafness." The next day Lady Harriet rolled over to Hollingford, and for the settling of her curiosity she called on the Miss Brownings, and introduced the subject. She would not have spoken about the rumour she had heard to any one who were not warm friends of Molly's. If Mr. Sheepshanks had chosen to allude to it when she had been riding with her father, she would very soon have silenced him by one of the haughty looks she knew full well how to assume. But she felt as if she must know the truth, and accordingly she began thus abruptly to Miss Browning. "What is all this I hear about my little friend Molly Gibson and Mr. Preston?" "Oh, Lady Harriet, have you heard of it? We are so sorry." "Sorry for what?" "I think, begging your ladyship's pardon, we had better not say any more till we know how much you know," said Miss Browning. "Nay," replied Lady Harriet, laughing a little, "I shan't tell what I know till I am sure you know more. Then we'll make an exchange if you like." "I'm afraid it's no laughing matter for poor Molly," said Miss Browning, shaking her head. "People do say such things." "But I don't believe them, indeed I don't," burst in Miss Phoebe, half crying. "No more will I, then," said Lady Harriet, taking the good lady's hand. "It's all very fine, Phoebe, saying you don't believe them, but I should like to know who it was that convinced me, sadly against my will, I am sure." "I only told you the facts as Mrs. Goodenough told them me, sister, but I'm sure if you had seen poor patient Molly as I have done, sitting up in a corner of a room, looking at the beauties of England and Wales, till she must have been sick of them, and no one speaking to her, and she as gentle and sweet as ever in the end of the evening, though maybe a bit pale, facts or no facts, I won't believe anything against her. So there sate Miss Phoebe, in tearful defiance of facts." "And, as I said before, I'm quite of your opinion," said Lady Harriet. "But how does your ladyship explain away her meetings with Mr. Preston in all sorts of unlikely and open air places?" asked Miss Browning, who, to do her justice, would have been only too glad to join Molly's partisans if she could have preserved her character for logical deduction at the same time. I went so far as to send for her father and tell him all about it. I thought at least he would have horsewhipped Mr. Preston, but he seems to have taken no notice of it. Then we may be quite sure he knows some way of explaining matters that we don't, said Lady Harriet decisively. After all, there may be 150 perfectly natural and justifiable explanations. Mr. Gibson knew none when I thought it my duty to speak to him, said Miss Browning. Why, suppose that Mr. Preston is engaged to Miss Kirkpatrick, and Molly is confidant and messenger. I don't see that your lady's supposition much alters the blame. Why, if he is honourably engaged to Cynthia Kirkpatrick, does he not visit her openly at her home in Mr. Gibson's house? Why does Molly lend herself to clandestine proceedings? One can't account for everything, said Lady Harriet, a little impatient, for reason was going hard against her. But I choose to have faith in Molly Gibson. I'm sure she's not done anything very wrong. I've a great mind to go and call on her. Mrs. Gibson is confined to her room with this horrid influenza, and take her with me on a round of calls through this little gossiping town, on Mrs. Goodenough or Badenough, who seems to have been propagating all these stories. But I've not time to-day. I've to meet Papa at 3, and it's 3 now. Only remember, Miss Phoebe, it's you and I against the world, in defence of a distressed damsel. Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, said she to herself as she ran lightly down Miss Browning's old-fashioned staircase. Now, I don't think that's pretty of you, Phoebe, said Miss Browning in some displeasure as soon as she was alone with her sister. First, you convince me against my will and make me very unhappy, and I have to do unpleasant things, all because you've made me believe that certain statements are true, and then you turn round and cry and say you don't believe a word of it at all, and make me out a regular ogre and backbiter. No, it's of no use. I shan't listen to you. So she left Miss Phoebe in tears and locked herself up in her own room. Lady Harriet, meanwhile, was riding homewards by her father's side, apparently listening to all he chose to say, but in reality turning over the probabilities and possibilities that might account for these strange interviews between Molly and Mr. Preston. It was a case of parler de l'un et l'un et voir les oreilles. At a turn in the road they saw Mr. Preston a little way before them, coming towards them on his good horse, point device in his riding attire. The Earl, in his threadbare coat and on his old brown cob, called out cheerfully, "Aha! Here's Preston. Good day to you. I was just wanting to ask you about that slip of pasture land on the home farm. John Brickhill wants to plough it up and crop it. It's not 2 acres at the best." While they were talking over this bit of land, Lady Harriet came to her resolution. As soon as her father had finished, she said, "Mr. Preston, perhaps you will allow me to ask you 1 or 2 questions to relieve my mind, for I am in some little perplexity at present." "Certainly. I shall only be too happy to give you any information in my power." But at the moment he had made this polite speech, he recollected Molly's speech, that she would refer her case to Lady Harriet. But the letters had been returned, and the affair was now wound up. She had come off conqueror, and he the vanquished. Surely she would never have been so ungenerous as to appeal after that. "There are reports about Miss Gibson and you current among the gossips of Hollingford. Are we to congratulate you on your engagement to that young lady?" "Ah, by the way, Preston, we ought to have done it before," interrupted Lord Cumnor in hasty goodwill. But his daughter said quietly, "Mr. Preston has not yet told us if the reports are well founded, papa." She looked at him with the air of a person expecting an answer, and expecting a truthful answer. "I am not so fortunate," replied he, trying to make his horse appear fidgety without incurring observation. "Then I may contradict that report?" asked Lady Harriet quietly, "or is there any reason for believing that in time it may come true? I ask because such reports, if unfounded, do harm to young ladies." "Keep other sweethearts off," put in Lord Cumnor, looking a good deal pleased at his own discernment. Lady Harriet went on, "And I take a great interest in Miss Gibson." Mr. Preston saw from her manner that he was in for it, as he expressed it to himself. The question was, how much or how little did she know? "I have no expectation or hope of ever having nearer interest in Miss Gibson than I have at present. I shall be glad if this straightforward answer relieves your ladyship from your perplexity." He could not help the touch of insolence that accompanied these last words. It was not in the words themselves, nor in the tone in which they were spoken, nor in the look which accompanied them. It was in all. It implied a doubt of Lady Harriet's right to question him as she did, and there was something of defiance in it as well. But this touch of insolence put Lady Harriet's mettle up. She was not one to check herself, in any course, for the opinion of an inferior. "Then, sir, you are aware of the injury you may do to a young lady's reputation if you meet her and detain her in long conversations when she is walking by herself unaccompanied by any one. You have given rise to reports." "My dear Harriet, are you not going too far? You don't know. Mr. Preston may have unacknowledged attentions." "No, my lord, I have no intentions with regard to Miss Gibson. She may be a very worthy young lady. I have no doubt she is. Lady Harriet seems to push me into such a position that I cannot but acknowledge myself to be. It is not enviable, not pleasant to own, but I am in fact a jilted man. Jilted by Miss Kirkpatrick, after a tolerably long engagement. My interviews with Miss Gibson were not of the most agreeable kind, as you may conclude when I tell you she was, I believe, the instigator. Certainly, she was the agent in this last step of Miss Kirkpatrick's. Is your ladyship's curiosity," with an emphasis on this last word, "satisfied with this rather mortifying confession of mine?" "Harriet, my dear, you've gone too far. We had no right to pry into Mr. Preston's private affairs." "No more I had," said Lady Harriet, with a smile of winning frankness, the first smile she had accorded Mr. Preston for many a long day, ever since the first time, years ago, when, presuming on his handsomeness, he had assumed a tone of gallant familiarity with Lady Harriet, and paid her personal compliments as he would have done to an equal. "But he will excuse me, I hope," continued she, still in that gracious manner which made him feel that he now held a much higher place in her esteem than he had had at the beginning of the interview, "when he learns that the busy tongues of the Hollingford ladies have been speaking of my friend, Miss Gibson, in the most unwarrantable manner, drawing unjustifiable inferences from the facts of that intercourse with Mr. Preston, the nature of which he has just conferred such a real obligation on me by explaining. I think I need hardly request Lady Harriet to consider this explanation of mine as confidential," said Mr. Preston. Of course," said the Earl. "Every one will understand that." And he rode home and told his wife and Lady Cuxhaven the whole conversation between Lady Harriet and Mr. Preston, in the strictest confidence, of course. Lady Harriet had to stand a good many strictures on manners and proper dignity for a few days after this. However, she consoled herself by calling on the Gibsons, and finding that Mrs. Gibson, who was still an invalid, was asleep at the time, she experienced no difficulty in carrying off the unconscious Molly for a walk, which Lady Harriet so contrived that they twice passed through all the length of the principal street of the town, loitered at Grinstead's for half an hour, and wound up by Lady Harriet's calling on the Miss Brownings, who, to her regret, were not at home. "Perhaps it is as well," said she, after a minute's consideration. "I'll leave my card and put your name down underneath it, Molly." Molly was a little puzzled by the manner in which she had been taken possession of, like an inanimate chattel, for all the afternoon, and exclaimed, "Please, Lady Harriet, I never leave cards. I have not got any, and on the Miss Brownings, of all people, why, I run in and out whenever I like." "Never mind, little one. To-day you shall do everything properly, and according to full etiquette. And now we tell Mrs. Gibson to come to the Towers for a long day. We will send the carriage for her whenever she will let us know that she is strong enough to come. Indeed, she had better come for a few days. At this time of year it does not do for an invalid to be out in the evenings, even in a carriage." So spoke Lady Harriet, standing on the white doorsteps at Miss Brownings, and holding Molly's hand while she wished her good-bye. "You'll tell her, dear, that I came partly to see her, but that finding her asleep I ran off with you. And don't forget about her coming to stay with us for a change of air. Mamma will like it, I'm sure, and the carriage, and all that. And now good-bye. We've done a good day's work, and better than you're aware of," continued she, still addressing Molly, though the latter was quite out of hearing. "Hollingford is not the place I take it to be, if it doesn't veer round in Miss Gibson's favour after my to-day's trotting of that child about." End of chapter 49. Read by Tora in Yellowstone National Park, December 2006.
Chapter 44 of Wives and Daughters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 44. Molly Gibson to the Rescue. It seemed curious enough, after the storms of the night, to meet in smooth tranquillity at breakfast. Cynthia was pale, but she talked as quietly as usual about all manner of indifferent things, while Molly sat silent, watching and wondering, and becoming convinced that Cynthia must have gone through a long experience of concealing her real thoughts and secret troubles before she could have been able to put on such a semblance of composure. Among the letters that came in that morning was one from the London Kirkpatricks, but not from Helen, Cynthia's own particular correspondent. Her sister wrote to apologize for Helen, who was not well, she said, had had the influenza, which had left her very weak and poorly. "Let her come down here for change of air," said Mr. Gibson. "The country at this time of year is better than London, excepting when the place is surrounded by trees. Now our house is well drained, high up, gravel soil, and I'll undertake to doctor her for nothing." "It would be charming," said Mrs. Gibson, rapidly revolving in her mind the changes necessary in her household economy before receiving a young lady accustomed to such a household as Mr. Kirkpatrick's, and calculating the consequent inconveniences in her own mind, weighing them against the probable advantages even while she spoke. "Should you not like it, Cynthia? And Molly too. You too, dear, would become acquainted with one of the girls, and I have no doubt you would be asked back again, which would be so very nice." "And I should not let her go," said Mr. Gibson, who had acquired an unfortunate facility of reading his wife's thoughts. "Dear Helen," went on Mrs. Gibson, "I should so like to nurse her. We would make your consulting room into her own private sitting room, my dear. It is hardly necessary to say that the scales had been weighed down by the inconveniences of having a person behind the scenes for several weeks; for with an invalid so much depends on tranquillity. In the drawing room, for instance, she might constantly be disturbed by callers, and the dining room is so what shall I call it? So dinnery, the smell of meals never seems to leave it. It would have been different if dear papa had allowed me to throw out that window." "Why can't she have the dressing room for her own bedroom, and the little room opening out of the drawing room for her sitting room?" asked Mr. Gibson. The library, for by this name Mrs. Gibson chose to dignify what had formerly been called the book closet. "Why, it would hardly hold a sofa, besides the books and the writing table, and there are draughts everywhere. No, my dear, we had better not ask her at all. Her own home is comfortable at any rate." "Well, well," said Mr. Gibson, seeing that he was to be worsted, and not caring enough about the matter to show fight. "Perhaps you are right. It's a case of luxury versus fresh air. Some people suffer more from the want of one than from want of the other. You know I shall be glad to see her if she likes to come, and take us as we are, but I can't give up the consulting room. It's a necessity, our daily bread." "I'll write and tell them how kind Mr. Gibson is," said his wife, in high contentment, as her husband left the room. "They'll be just as much obliged to him as if she had come." Whether it was Helen's illness, or from some other cause, after breakfast Cynthia became very flat and absent, and this lasted all day long. Molly understood now why her moods had been so changeable for many months, and was tender and forbearing with her accordingly. Towards evening, when the two girls were left alone, Cynthia came and stood over Molly so that her face could not be seen. "Molly," said she, "will you do it? Will you do what you said last night? I have been thinking of it all day, and sometimes I believe he would give you back the letters if you asked him. He might fancy at any rate, it's worth trying, if you don't very much dislike it." Now it so happened that with every thought she had given to it, Molly disliked the idea of the proposed interview with Mr. Preston more and more, and she neither could nor would draw back from it. It might do good; she did not see how it could possibly do harm. So she gave her consent, and tried to conceal her distaste, which grew upon her more and more as Cynthia hastily arranged the details. "You shall meet him in the avenue leading from the Park Lodge up to the Towers. He can come in one way from the Towers, where he has often business. He has pass keys everywhere. You can go in as we have often done by the lodge. You need not go far." It did strike Molly that Cynthia must have had some experience in making all these arrangements, and she did venture to ask how he was to be informed of all this. Cynthia only reddened and replied, "Oh, never mind. He will only be too glad to come. You heard him say he wished to discuss the affair more. It is the first time the appointment has come from my side. If I can but once be free, oh, Molly, I will love you and be grateful to you all my life." Molly thought of Roger, and that thought prompted her next speech. "It must be horrible. I think I'm very brave, but I don't think I could have accepted even Roger with a half-cancelled engagement hanging over me." She blushed as she spoke. "You forget how I detest Mr. Preston," said Cynthia. "It was that, more than any excess of love for Roger, that made me thankful to be at last as securely pledged to someone else. He did not want to call it an engagement, but I did, because it gave me the feeling of assurance that I was free from Mr. Preston. And so I am, all but these letters. Oh, if you can but make him take back his abominable money and get me my letters, then we would bury it all in oblivion, and he could marry somebody else, and I would marry Roger, and no one would be the wiser. After all, it was only what people call youthful folly, and you may tell Mr. Preston that as soon as he makes my letters public, shows them to your father or anything, I'll go away from Hollingford and never come back." Loaded with many such messages, which she felt that she should never deliver, not really knowing what she should say, hating the errand, not satisfied with Cynthia's manner of speaking about her relations to Roger, oppressed with shame and complicity in conduct which appeared to her deceitful, yet willing to bear all and brave all if she could once set Cynthia in a straight path, in a clear space, and almost more pitiful to her friend's great distress and possible disgrace than able to give her that love which involves perfect sympathy. Molly set out on her walk towards the appointed place. It was a cloudy, blustering day, and the noise of the blowing wind among the nearly leafless branches of the great trees filled her ears as she passed through the park gates and entered the avenue. She walked quickly, instinctively wishing to get her blood up, and have no time for thought. But there was a bend in the avenue about a quarter of a mile from the lodge. After that bend it was a straight line up to the great house, now emptied of its inhabitants. Molly did not like going quite out of sight of the lodge, and she stood facing it close by the trunk of one of the trees. Presently she heard a step coming over the grass. It was Mr. Preston. He saw a woman's figure half behind the trunk of a tree, and made no doubt that it was Cynthia. But when he came nearer, almost close, the figure turned round, and instead of the brilliantly coloured face of Cynthia, he met the pale, resolved look of Molly. She did not speak to greet him, but though he felt sure from the general aspect of pallor and timidity that she was afraid of him, her steady grey eyes met his with courageous innocence. "Is Cynthia unable to come?" asked he, perceiving that she expected him. "I did not know you thought that you should meet her," said Molly, a little surprised. In her simplicity she had believed that Cynthia had named that it was she, Molly Gibson, who would meet Mr. Preston at a given time and place. But Cynthia had been too worldly wise for that, and had decoyed him thither by a vaguely worded note, which, while avoiding actual falsehood, had led him to believe that she herself would give him the meeting. She said she should be here," said Mr. Preston, extremely annoyed at being entrapped, as he now felt that he had been, into an interview with Miss Gibson. Molly hesitated a little before she spoke. He was determined not to break the silence. As she had intruded herself into the affair, she should find her situation as awkward as possible. "At any rate, she sent me here to meet you," said Molly. "She has told me exactly how matters stand between you and her." "Has she?" sneered he. "She is not always the most open or reliable person in the world." Molly reddened. She perceived the impertinence of the tone, and her temper was none of the coolest; but she mastered herself, and gained courage by doing so. "You should not speak so of the person you profess to wish to have for your wife. But putting all that aside, you have some letters of hers that she wishes to have back again." "I daresay." "And that you have no right to keep." "No legal or no moral right? Which do you mean?" "I do not know. Simply you have no right at all, as a gentleman, to keep a girl's letters when she asks for them back again, much less to hold them over her as a threat." "I see you do know all, Miss Gibson," said he, changing his manner to one of more respect. "At least she has told you her story from her point of view, her side. Now you must hear mine. She promised me as solemnly as ever woman. She was not a woman. She was only a girl, barely 16, old enough to know what she was doing. But I'll call her a girl, if you like. She promised me solemnly to be my wife, making the one stipulation of secrecy, and a certain period of waiting. She wrote me letters repeating this promise, and confidential enough to prove that she considered herself bound to me by such an implied relation. I don't give in to humbug. I don't set myself up as a saint, and in most ways I can look after my own interests pretty keenly. You know enough of her position as a penniless girl, and at that time with no influential connections to take the place of wealth, and help me on in the world. It was as sincere and unworldly a passion as ever man felt. She must say so herself. I might have married 2 or 3 girls with plenty of money. One of them was handsome enough, and not at all reluctant." Molly interrupted him. She was chafed at the conceit of his manner. "I beg your pardon, but I do not want to hear accounts of young ladies whom you might have married. I came here simply on behalf of Cynthia, who does not like you, and who does not wish to marry you." "Well, then, I must make her like me, as you call it. She did like me once, and made promises which she will find it requires the consent of 2 people to break. I don't despair of making her love me as much as she ever did, according to her letters at least, when we are married." "She will never marry you," said Molly firmly. "Then if she ever honours any one else with her preference, he shall be allowed the perusal of her letters to me." Molly almost could have laughed. She was so secure and certain that Roger would never read letters offered to him under these circumstances; but then she thought that he would feel such pain at the whole affair, and at the contact with Mr. Preston, especially if he had not heard of it from Cynthia first, and if she, Molly, could save him pain, she would. Before she could settle what to say, Mr. Preston spoke again. "You said the other day that Cynthia was engaged. May I ask whom to?" "No," said Molly, "you may not. You heard her say it was not an engagement. It is not exactly; and if it were a full engagement, do you think, after what you last said, I should tell you to whom? But you may be sure of this, he would never read a line of your letters. He is too no, I won't speak of him before you. You could never understand him. Seems to me that this mysterious he is a very fortunate person to have such a warm defender in Miss Gibson, to whom he is not at all engaged," said Mr. Preston, with so disagreeable a look on his face that Molly suddenly found herself on the point of bursting into tears. But she rallied herself, and worked on, for Cynthia first, and for Roger as well. "No honourable man or woman will read your letters, and if any people do read them, they will be so much ashamed of it that they won't dare to speak of them. What use can they be of to you?" "They contain Cynthia's reiterated promises of marriage," replied he. "She says she would rather leave Hollingford for ever and go out to earn her bread than marry you." His face fell a little. He looked so bitterly mortified that Molly was almost sorry for him. "Does she say that to you in cold blood? Do you know you are telling me very hard truths, Miss Gibson, if they are truths. That is to say," he continued, recovering himself a little, "young ladies are very fond of the words hate and detest. I have known many who have applied them to men whom they were all the time hoping to marry." "I cannot tell about other people," said Molly. "I only know that Cynthia does." Here she hesitated for a moment. She fell for his pain, and so she hesitated, but then she brought it out. "Does as nearly hate you as anybody like her ever does hate." "Like her," said he, repeating the words almost unconsciously, seizing on anything to try and hide his mortification. "I mean I should hate worse," said Molly, in a low voice. But he did not attend much to her answer. He was working the point of his stick into the turf, and his eyes were bent on it. "So now, would you mind sending her back the letters by me? I do assure you that you cannot make her marry you." "You are very simple, Miss Gibson," said he, suddenly lifting up his head. "I suppose that you don't know that there is any other feeling that can be gratified excepting love. Have you never heard of revenge? Cynthia had cajoled me with promises, and little as you or she may believe me, well, it's of no use speaking of that. I don't mean to let her go unpunished. You may tell her that. I shall keep the letters, and make use of them as I see fit when the occasion arises." Molly was miserably angry with herself for her mismanagement of the affair. She had hoped to succeed, and she had only made matters worse. What new argument could she use? Meanwhile he went on, lashing himself up as he thought how the two girls must have talked him over, bringing in wounded vanity to add to the rage of disappointed love. "Mr. Osborne Hamley may hear of their contents, though he may be too honourable to read them. Nay, even your father may hear whispers; and if I remember them rightly, Miss Cynthia Kirkpatrick does not always speak in the most respectful terms of the lady who is now Mrs. Gibson. There are—" "Stop," said Molly. "I won't hear anything out of these letters, written when she was almost without friends, to you whom she looked upon as a friend. But I have thought of what I will do next. I give you fair warning. If I had not been foolish, I should have told my father, but Cynthia made me promise that I would not. So I will tell it all, from beginning to end, to Lady Harriet, and ask her to speak to her father. I feel sure that she will do it, and I don't think you will dare to refuse Lord Cumnor." He felt at once that he should not dare; that, clever land agent as he was, and high up in the Earl's favour on that account, yet that the conduct of which he had been guilty about these letters, and the threats which he had held out about them, were just what no gentleman, no honourable man, no manly man, could put up with in any one about him. He knew that much, and he wondered how she, the girl standing before him, had been clever enough to find it out. He forgot himself for an instant in admiration of her. There she stood, frightened, yet brave, not letting go her hold on what she meant to do, even when things seemed most against her. And besides, there was something that struck him most of all, perhaps, and which shows the kind of man he was. He perceived that Molly was as unconscious that he was a young man and she a young woman, as if she had been a pure angel of heaven. Though he felt that he would have to yield and give up the letters, he was not going to do it at once; and while he was thinking what to say, so as to evade making any concession till he had had time to think it over, he, with his quick senses all about him, heard the trotting of a horse cranching quickly along over the gravel of the drive. A moment afterwards Molly's perception overtook his. He could see the startled look overspread her face, and in an instant she would have run away, but before the first rush was made, Mr. Preston laid his hand firmly on her arm. "Keep quiet. You must be seen. You, at any rate, have done nothing to be ashamed of." As he spoke, Mr. Sheepshanks came round the bend of the road and was close upon them. Mr. Preston saw, if Molly did not, the sudden look of intelligence that dawned upon the shrewd ruddy face of the old gentleman; saw, but did not much heed. He went forwards and spoke to Mr. Sheepshanks, who made a halt right before them. "Miss Gibson, your servant. Rather a blustering day for a young lady to be out, and cold, I should say, for standing still too long. Eh, Preston?" poking his whip at the latter in a knowing manner. "Yes," said Mr. Preston, "and I'm afraid I have kept Miss Gibson too long standing." Molly did not know what to say or do, so she only bowed a silent farewell, and turned away to go home, feeling very heavy at heart at the non-success of her undertaking. For she did not know how she had conquered, in fact, although Mr. Preston might not as yet acknowledge it even to himself. Before she was out of hearing she heard Mr. Sheepshanks say, "Sorry to have disturbed your tête-à-tête, Preston." But though she heard the words, their implied sense did not sink into her mind. She was only feeling how she had gone out glorious and confident, and was coming back to Cynthia defeated. Cynthia was on the watch for her return, and rushing downstairs, dragged Molly into the dining-room. "Well, Molly? Oh, I see you have not got them. After all, I never expected it." She sat down as if she could get over her disappointment better in that position, and Molly stood like a guilty person before her. "I am so sorry. I did all I could. We were interrupted at last. Mr. Sheepshanks rode up. Provoking old man! Do you think you should have persuaded him to give up the letters if you had had more time?" "I don't know. I wished Mr. Sheepshanks had not come just then. I did not like his finding me standing talking to Mr. Preston." "Oh, I daresay he would never think anything about it. What did Mr. Preston, say?" "He seemed to think you were fully engaged to him, and that these letters were the only proof he had. I think he loves you in his way." "His way, indeed!" said Cynthia scornfully. "The more I think of it, the more I see it would be better for papa to speak to him. I did say I would tell it all to Lady Harriet, and get Lord Cumnor to make him give up the letters, but it would be very awkward." "Very," said Cynthia gloomily, "but he would see it was only a threat. But I will do it in a moment if you like. I meant what I said, only I feel that papa would manage it best of all, and more privately." "I'll tell you what, Molly, you're bound by a promise, you know, and cannot tell Mr. Gibson without breaking your solemn word; but it's just this: I'll leave Hollingford, and never come back again if ever your father hears of this affair. There!" Cynthia stood up now, and began to fold up Molly's shawl in her nervous excitement. "Oh, Cynthia! Roger!" was all that Molly said. "Yes, I know. You need not remind me of him. But I'm not going to live in the house with any one who may be always casting up in his mind the things he has heard against me, faults perhaps, which sound so much worse than they really are. I was so happy when I first came here. You all liked me, and admired me, and thought well of me. And now why, Molly, I can see the difference in you already. You carry your thoughts in your face. I have read them there these 2 days. You've been thinking, 'How Cynthia must have deceived me, keeping up a correspondence all this time, having half engagements to 2 men.' You've been more full of that than of pity for me as a girl who has always been obliged to manage for herself, without any friend to help her and protect her." Molly was silent. There was a great deal of truth in what Cynthia was saying, and yet a great deal of falsehood. For through all this long 48 hours Molly had loved Cynthia dearly, and had been more weighed down by the position the latter was in than Cynthia herself. She also knew, but this was a second thought following on the other, that she had suffered much pain in trying to do her best in this interview with Mr. Preston. She had been tried beyond her strength, and the great tears welled up in her eyes and fell slowly down her cheeks. "Oh, what a brute I am!" said Cynthia, kissing them away. "I see. I know it is the truth, and I deserve it, but I need not reproach you." "You did not reproach me," said Molly, trying to smile. "I have thought some of what you said, but I do love you dearly, dearly, Cynthia. I should have done just the same as you did." "No, you would not. Your grain is different somehow." Chapter 45.